Case 1. Gabriel Fernandez. In the quiet classrooms of Summerwind Elementary School in Palmdale, California, 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez was known for one thing above all else: his kindness. While other kids his age were still learning to share, Gabriel was already helping his classmates with their schoolwork, offering encouragement when they struggled, and making sure no one felt left out. His teacher would later remember him as the type of child who made you believe in goodness, the kind of student who reminded you why you became an educator in the first place. But behind the sweet smile Gabriel wore at school, behind the careful way he moved and the long sleeves he wore, even in the California heat, there existed a nightmare that defied comprehension. The small home on the 200 block of East Avenue Q10 in Palmdale looked ordinary enough from the outside. Just another residence in a working-class neighborhood where families struggled to make ends meet, and neighbors minded their own business. But inside that house, in those months of 2012 and early 2013, Gabriel Fernandez was living through hell on earth. His mother, 30-year-old Pearl Fernandez, had brought her boyfriend Isaro Aguirre into their lives, a 32-year-old man who prosecutors would later describe as pure evil. And together, this couple embarked on a campaign of torture so systematic, so unrelenting, that even seasoned investigators would be left shaking their heads in disbelief. The abuse took many forms, each more horrific than the last. Gabriel was routinely beaten with baseball bats, his small body absorbing blows that would have hospitalized most adults. Aguirre shot him with a BB gun, not once, but repeatedly, embedding the small metal pellets in Gabriel's skin like brutal souvenirs of his suffering. The boy was forced to eat cat feces, a degradation that served no purpose except cruelty. When Gabriel wasn't being actively tortured, he was locked in a small cabinet, bound and gagged, kept like an animal in the very home where he should have been safe. Why? That's the question that haunts everyone who learns about Gabriel's case. Why would a mother allow, even participate in, the systematic torture of her own child? According to prosecutors, Aguirre had targeted Gabriel specifically because he believed the 8-year-old boy was gay. In Aguirre's twisted worldview, this suspicion justified unspeakable cruelty. He wanted to toughen up the boy, to beat the perceived weakness out of him. But this wasn't discipline. This was sadism, wearing the mask of parenting. Pearl, who was later diagnosed with developmental disabilities and multiple mental health issues, including a depressive disorder and PTSD, didn't protect her son. Whether out of fear of Aguirre, her own participation in the abuse, or a toxic combination of both, she allowed the torture to continue day after day, week after week, month after month. Here's what makes Gabriel's story even more tragic. People knew, they saw, they reported, and still the system failed him. Gabriel's teacher noticed bruises. She saw how carefully the boy moved, how he flinched at sudden movements. When she asked, Gabriel told her the truth, that his mother had punched him, that she had forced his head underwater. The teacher, doing exactly what she was supposed to do, reported this to the authorities. Family members saw the signs too. They noticed Gabriel's appearance deteriorating, his demeanor changing. They made calls, raised concerns, tried to intervene. Social workers from the Department of Children and Family Services visited the home multiple times. They had reports. They had evidence. They had a child literally telling them he was being abused. And yet, time and time again, Gabriel was left in that house, left with Pearl and Aguirre, left to suffer. Between 2012 and 2013, there were 8 separate reports made to DCFS about Gabriel's welfare. 8 times the system had a chance to save him. 8 times adults whose job it was to protect children failed to act decisively. The reasons varied: inconsistent follow-up, closed cases before investigation completion, failure to interview Gabriel separately from his abusers, overwhelming caseloads, bureaucratic red tape. But the result was always the same. Gabriel went back to the house on East Avenue Q10. By May 2013, Gabriel's small body was covered in bruises, burns, and broken bones. The BB pellets embedded in his skin and groin area told a story of prolonged torture. His ribs were cracked. He had been sleeping in that small cabinet, sometimes for days at a time, denied food and water, kept in his own filth. On May 22, 2013, the abuse reached its inevitable, horrific conclusion. The details of those hours are almost too brutal to recount. Gabriel was beaten so severely that his skull was cracked, his ribs broken. When Los Angeles County Fire Department paramedics arrived at the home on May 22nd, responding to a call that Gabriel wasn't breathing, they found a scene that would haunt them for years. The 8-year-old boy was declared brain dead at the hospital. He clung to life for 2 more days while doctors tried desperately to save him. But on May 24, 2013, Gabriel Fernandez died from his injuries. He had lived just 8 years, and he had spent the last several months of his life in agony. The arrests came swiftly once Gabriel's cause of death was determined. Pearl Fernandez and Isauro Aguirre were both charged with murder, with special circumstances of torture that made them eligible for the death penalty. Aguirre went to trial maintaining his innocence and claiming Pearl was responsible for most of the abuse. The jury didn't buy it. In November 2017, they found him guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of intentional murder by torture. A month later, they recommended death. Superior Court Judge George G. Lomeli, in handing down the sentence, called it the most aggravated and egregious case of torture this court has ever witnessed. He told Aguirre directly, "You want to say that the conduct was animalistic, but that would be wrong because even animals know how to take care of their young. It's beyond animalistic." Aguirre was sent to death row, currently housed at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego as he awaits execution, an execution that may never come given California's moratorium on the death penalty. Pearl took a different path. In February 2018, just before her trial was set to begin, she pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and admitted the special circumstance allegation of murder involving torture. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, she accepted a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. At her sentencing, she offered a brief statement. "I want to say I'm sorry to my family for what I did. I wish Gabriel was alive. Every day I wish that I made better choices." But the judge wasn't moved by her remorse. He made it clear that Pearl Fernandez would never walk free again. She now serves her sentence at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, where she will remain for the rest of her natural life. Both have appealed their convictions. Both appeals have been denied. In the aftermath of Gabriel's death, public outrage focused not just on Pearl and Aguirre, but on the system that failed to protect him. 4 social workers, Stephanie Rodriguez, Patricia Clement, Kevin Baum, and Gregory Merritt, were criminally charged with 1 felony count each of child abuse and falsifying public records. The charges were unprecedented. Never before had social workers been criminally prosecuted for failing to remove a child who later died. The Los Angeles County District Attorney argued that these 4 individuals had seen Gabriel, documented his injuries, and then falsified records to make it appear they had conducted thorough investigations when they hadn't. The case made it all the way through preliminary hearings and was headed to trial when, in 2020, an appeals court made a stunning decision. They dismissed all charges. The court ruled that while the social workers may have failed in their duties, criminal prosecution was not appropriate. The decision was controversial, with many arguing that without criminal consequences, social workers would never be incentivized to take decisive action to protect children. The social workers maintained they had followed protocols and that the true villains were Pearl and Aguirre. Critics argued that following protocols when a child is clearly being tortured is not enough. that these professionals should have done more, risked more, fought harder to save Gabriel's life. Gabriel Fernandez's death sent shockwaves through California's child welfare system and beyond. His case became a symbol of everything that can go wrong when bureaucracy, overworked social workers, inadequate training, and systemic failures combine with the worst impulses of human nature. In response, California implemented reforms aimed at improving the Child Protective Services system, more training for social workers, reduced caseloads, better coordination between agencies, more aggressive intervention protocols. Whether these reforms would have saved Gabriel is impossible to know. Whether they will save the next Gabriel remains to be seen. Gabriel's story reached a global audience in 2020 when Netflix released The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, a 6-episode documentary series that examined not just his death, but the systemic failures that allowed it to happen. The series forced millions of viewers to confront uncomfortable questions about how society protects or fails to protect its most vulnerable members. His teacher, Jennifer Garcia, who had reported the abuse and tried to save him, spoke at Aguirre's trial about the lasting impact of Gabriel's death. She described him as a kind child who liked to help his classmates. She said his abuse and death would haunt her for the rest of her life. "They are evil people for what they did," she testified, "and despite how I feel, I know that if Gabriel had survived, he wouldn't have wanted his mom or his sorrow to be punished for anything that they did to him, because that is the kind of person he was." That testimony, the idea that Gabriel, even after everything that was done to him, wouldn't have wanted his abusers punished, speaks to the profound tragedy at the heart of this case. A child so good, so kind, so full of love that even his own suffering wouldn't turn him cruel. A child who deserved every protection society could offer. A child who got none. Gabriel Fernandez's case forces us to confront deeply uncomfortable questions. How many visits does it take before a social worker removes a child from a home? How many reports must be filed? How many bruises must be documented? At what point does family reunification, a noble goal in child welfare, become a death sentence for a child who keeps getting sent back to his abusers? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many other children are suffering right now, at this very moment, in homes where the curtains are drawn and the neighbors mind their own business and the social workers check a few boxes and move on to the next overwhelming case? Gabriel loved helping people. He loved his classmates. He loved learning. By all accounts, despite the hell he was living through, he remained a sweet, caring child. The world took that beautiful soul and crushed it through cruelty, negligence, and systemic failure. His small body rests in a cemetery now, lies safe from harm. But his story continues to echo through courtrooms, policy meetings, and the nightmares of everyone who failed him. Because Gabriel Fernandez didn't just die in that house in Palmdale, he was murdered by two evil individuals and failed by a society that knew he was suffering and didn't do enough to stop it. The question isn't whether we could have saved Gabriel Fernandez. The question is whether we will do better for the next child who tells a teacher they're being hurt, who shows up to school with bruises, who desperately needs someone, anyone, to fight for them the way no one fought for Gabriel. That's his legacy. That's what we owe him. Not just outrage and Netflix documentaries, but actual meaningful change that ensures no child ever again suffers the way he did while the adults who could save him looked the other way, 8 years old. That's all the time Gabriel Fernandez got, and it wasn't nearly enough. Case 2, David and Louise Turpin. If you had scrolled through David and Louise Turpin's Facebook page in 2016, you would have seen what appeared to be a large, happy family. There were photos from a trip to Disneyland, all 13 children lined up in matching outfits, their parents beaming with pride. There were pictures from a Las Vegas wedding vow renewal ceremony where David, 57, and Louise, 49, dressed like Elvis and Priscilla, surrounded by their kids in coordinated costumes. The family smiled for the camera, perfectly posed, perfectly dressed, perfectly wrong. Because behind those carefully staged photographs was a reality so horrific that when police entered the Turpin home in Perris, California on January 14, 2018, seasoned officers, people who had seen the worst of humanity, would be brought to tears. This wasn't just child abuse. This was decades of systematic torture, starvation, and imprisonment. This was a house where children were chained to their beds like animals, where showers were permitted once a year, where adult children who should have been living independent lives instead weighed less than their 12-year-old siblings, their growth stunted by years of deliberate starvation and neglect. This was the Turpin House of Horrors. On the morning of January 14, 2018, a 17-year-old girl managed to do something she had been planning for 2 years. She escaped through a window of the Perris home and called 911 on a deactivated cell phone she had secretly taken from the house. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial. When the dispatcher answered, the teen's voice was terrified but determined. She told the operator that her parents had abused her and her siblings. She said some of her brothers and sisters were chained up. She said she had photos as evidence on the phone. She said she needed help. The dispatcher, recognizing the urgency and sincerity in the girl's voice, immediately sent deputies from the Riverside County Sheriff's Department to meet her. When they arrived, they encountered a person who looked much younger than 17, so emaciated and underdeveloped that the deputies initially thought she was a child of 10 or 11. Her cognitive impairment was immediately apparent. She struggled to articulate what was happening, not because she didn't want to tell them, but because years of isolation and malnutrition had stunted her mental development. But she knew she needed help, and she knew her siblings needed help even more. When deputies arrived at the modest single-story home on Muir Woods Road in Perris, nothing from the outside suggested the nightmare within. David and Louise Turpin answered the door, confused about why police were there. They seemed almost annoyed by the intrusion, as if the officers were interrupting a normal Sunday morning. But as officers entered the home, the smell hit them first, a putrid combination of human waste, unwashed, bodies, and decay. The house was dark, with many windows covered. And then they saw the children. 12 siblings ranging in age from 2 to 29 years old were found in conditions that defied comprehension. Some were shackled to beds with chains and padlocks, their wrists rubbed raw from the restraints. The children, who were actually legal adults, looked like emaciated teenagers, their bodies so malnourished that their development had essentially frozen in childhood. A 29-year-old woman weighed only 82 pounds. A 22-year-old weighed less than her 12-year-old brother. Their arms were stick-thin, their faces gaunt and hollow. When officers asked them basic questions, many couldn't answer coherently. They had been so isolated from the world that they didn't understand fundamental concepts most people take for granted. The living conditions were medieval. The children were kept in dark, foul-smelling rooms. They were denied access to bathrooms, forced to relieve themselves where they were chained. They were permitted to shower only once per year. When they did shower, it had to be scheduled and supervised, not for safety, but for control. The only toys in the house were still in their original packaging, never opened, bought solely for the photographs David and Louise would stage to present the image of a normal family to the outside world. The children weren't allowed to play with them. What David and Louise Turpin did to their children wasn't neglect. It was deliberate, systematic torture carried out over decades. The starvation was methodical. The children were fed on a strict schedule, usually once a day, sometimes less. Meals were meager: peanut butter sandwiches, frozen burritos, scraps that wouldn't sustain a growing body. The parents, meanwhile, maintained healthy weights, eating regular meals while their children wasted away. But here's what makes it even more cruel. The children could see food. The Turpin parents would buy pies and leave them on the counter where the starving children could see them but not touch them. David and Louise would eat in front of their kids, taunting them with the normalcy they would never experience. If a child tried to take food, the punishment was severe: beatings, extended periods of being chained up, additional restrictions. The physical abuse was constant and brutal. The children were beaten for perceived infractions. They were strangled. They were struck hard enough to leave lasting injuries. And when they cried or complained, they were punished more severely. Perhaps most insidiously, David and Louise isolated their children from any outside contact that might expose the abuse. The children were homeschooled, though this was merely a pretense to keep them hidden. They received minimal actual education. They had no friends, no outside activities, no contact with extended family. Their grandparents were kept away with excuses and evasions. The children were allowed out of the house only rarely, usually for the staged photo opportunities that David and Louise used to maintain their facade. The trips to Disneyland, the Las Vegas vow renewals, these weren't acts of love or normalcy. They were performances, carefully controlled events where the children were dressed up, told exactly how to behave, and then returned to their prison once the photos were taken. What's particularly disturbing about the Turpin case is that several of the victims were legal adults, people in their 20s who could have, theoretically, just walked out the door and called for help. So why didn't they? The answer lies in the psychological control David and Louise exerted over their children. When you've been isolated your entire life, when you've been told that the outside world is dangerous, when you've been beaten and starved and chained until you believe you deserve it, escape becomes almost impossible to conceptualize. The adult children had cognitive impairments from years of malnutrition. They had never been to school, never had jobs, never learned to drive. They didn't understand how the world worked beyond the walls of their prison. Many didn't even know what year it was, couldn't name the current president, couldn't perform basic mathematical calculations. They had been conditioned through years of abuse to obey without question, to accept their situation as normal, or at least as inescapable. The psychological chains were just as strong as the physical ones. That 17-year-old girl who escaped? She was extraordinary. For 2 years she had been planning. She had been watching, learning, gathering courage. She had taken that phone and hidden it, waiting for the right moment. She had convinced herself that the outside world might be better than what she knew, even though everything her parents had told her suggested otherwise. She saved her siblings by refusing to accept that her reality was normal. Once inside the home, the Riverside County Sheriff's Department immediately took David and Louise Turpin into custody. The parents seemed genuinely surprised that what they had been doing was considered criminal. They had been getting away with it for so long, decades of abuse, dozens of opportunities for someone to notice, that they appeared to believe they were untouchable. The children were taken to local hospitals where doctors confirmed what the officers had witnessed: extreme malnutrition, cognitive impairments consistent with long-term starvation, signs of physical abuse, both recent and historical, developmental delays, and psychological trauma that would require years of treatment. The investigation quickly revealed the scope of the horror. David and Louise had started their family in Texas in the 1980s, and the abuse had apparently begun early and escalated over time. The family had moved multiple times, from Texas to California, from one California home to another, always staying just ahead of any questions, always keeping their children isolated. Neighbors in Paris told reporters they rarely saw the children. When they did catch glimpses, the kids looked pale, thin, and frightened. Some neighbors had called authorities with concerns, but the calls never resulted in meaningful investigation. The family appeared to have some money. David worked as an engineer at Northrop Grumman, and they didn't fit the profile that typically triggers aggressive child welfare intervention. David Alan Turpin and Louise Anna Turpin were initially charged with multiple counts of torture, child abuse, dependent adult abuse, and false imprisonment. The charges were staggering in number because prosecutors counted each instance of abuse against each child separately, resulting in dozens of individual counts. As the case moved through the courts, the evidence mounted. Journals kept by the children documented years of abuse. Photos on David and Louise's phones showed children chained to beds. Medical records confirmed the malnutrition and abuse. And the children themselves, despite their cognitive impairments and psychological trauma, were able to tell investigators what had happened to them. Facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of spending the rest of their lives in prison with no chance of parole, David and Louise Turpin accepted a plea deal in February 2019. They pleaded guilty to 14 counts each, including torture, dependent adult abuse, child endangerment, and false imprisonment. The plea deal allowed them to avoid trial and spared their children from having to testify in detail about the abuse. Instead, the victims would have the opportunity to speak at sentencing if they chose. The sentencing hearing in April 2019 was one of the most emotional courtroom proceedings in recent California history. Some of the Turpin children chose to address their parents directly. What they said was both heartbreaking and inspiring. One daughter, her voice strong despite her tears, told her parents, "My parents took my whole life from me, but now I'm taking my life back. Life may have been bad, but it made me strong. I saw my dad change my mom. They almost changed me. But I'm a fighter. I'm strong." Another daughter's statement was read in court. "I cannot describe in words what we went through growing up. Sometimes I still have nightmares of things that happened, such as my siblings being chained up or getting beaten. But that is the past, and this is now." Remarkably, some of the children expressed forgiveness, or at least a complex mix of emotions that included love for their parents, alongside acknowledgement of the abuse. One statement read, "I want the court to know that our parents loved each other and loved each of their children. I believe with all my heart that our parents tried their best to raise all 13 of us, and they wanted to give us a good life." This statement in particular shocked observers. How could someone who suffered such horrific abuse still speak of parental love? But trauma and family dynamics are complicated. For these children, David and Louise were the only parents they had ever known, the only constants in their isolated world. The psychological manipulation ran so deep that, even after escape, some children struggled to fully condemn their abusers. Other statements were more direct in their anger. "I love both of my parents so much, but what they did cannot be described in words. They had no regard for us. I'm not going to say that I hope they die in there, but I'm hoping that they live the rest of their lives there." Judge Bernard Schwartz made it clear in his sentencing remarks that he found the Turpin parents' actions incomprehensible. He detailed the systematic torture, the deliberate starvation, the psychological abuse that had robbed these children of their childhoods, their education, their development, and nearly their lives. David Alan Turpin was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Louise Anna Turpin received the same sentence. Under California law, this means they will be eligible for parole after serving 25 years in 2044, when David is 82 and Louise is 74. The judge noted that the plea agreement took the death penalty off the table, but ensured the Turpins would spend the majority of their remaining lives incarcerated. He expressed hope that they would use that time to reflect on the suffering they had caused and, perhaps eventually, to understand the magnitude of their crimes. David and Louise showed little emotion during the sentencing. Louise cried at points, wiping away tears as her children spoke. David remained largely stoic, occasionally glancing at his children but offering no apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing beyond his guilty plea. They were separated and sent to different California prisons where they remain today, their once tight partnership broken by the legal system that belatedly intervened in their children's lives. In the months and years following their rescue, the Turpin siblings faced the enormous challenge of learning to live in a world they had been hidden from their entire lives. The 7 adult children and 6 minors were placed in foster care and group homes while social services worked to provide them with the support they needed. The recovery process has been difficult and complicated. Several of the adult children have spoken publicly about their experiences, not to relitigate the abuse, but to celebrate their survival and progress. They've learned to drive, gotten jobs, made friends, experienced the simple pleasures of choosing their own food and clothes and activities. But the trauma doesn't disappear overnight. Years of malnutrition left some with permanent physical effects: shorter stature, dental problems, weakened bones. The cognitive impairments require ongoing therapy and education. The psychological scars run deep, manifesting in PTSD, anxiety, difficulty trusting others, and challenges navigating social situations that others take for granted. Jack Osborne, an attorney representing 7 of the adult children, said at a press conference after the sentencing, "Our clients are most of all survivors. They are not victims. The Turpin children are not victims. They are survivors, and they are moving forward with their lives." This distinction, survivors, not victims, is crucial to how the siblings have chosen to frame their own stories. They refuse to be defined solely by what was done to them. They are building new identities, new lives, new relationships with each other, and with the world their parents tried so hard to keep them from knowing. Like Gabriel Fernandez's case before it, the Turpin case exposed serious failures in the systems meant to protect children. How did David and Louise Turpin torture 13 children for decades without intervention? The answer lies in several systemic weaknesses. Homeschooling oversight. California, like many states, has relatively lax oversight of homeschooling families. The Turpins registered as a private school, a designation that required virtually no accountability, no testing, no home visits, no verification that education was actually occurring. They filled out paperwork and were essentially left alone. Isolation and mobility. The family moved multiple times, making it difficult for any one community to notice patterns of concern. Each time they relocated, they were strangers with no history, no connections, no one watching closely. Socioeconomic assumptions. David Turpin had a good job at a respected aerospace company. The family lived in a middle-class neighborhood. They didn't fit the stereotype of abusive parents that often triggers intervention. There's an unfortunate tendency in social services to focus resources on poor families while assuming that middle-class families with employed parents are probably fine. Lack of mandatory reporters. Because the children weren't in school, they had no regular contact with teachers, counselors, doctors, or other mandatory reporters who might have noticed signs of abuse and neglected to report them. Minimal investigation of concerns. Neighbors who did call authorities found their concerns dismissed or minimally investigated. Without obvious evidence of immediate danger, and with parents who could present a veneer of normalcy, the complaints went nowhere. The Turpin case has prompted some states to strengthen homeschooling oversight requirements, but progress has been slow. Many homeschooling advocacy groups resist increased regulation, arguing that the vast majority of homeschooling families are providing excellent education and that cases like the Turpins are rare outliers. While this is true, the question remains, how do we identify the outliers before children spend decades in chains? Perhaps the most discussed aspect of the Turpin case is the forgiveness some of the children expressed toward their parents. How can someone who was starved, beaten, and chained for years still speak of love for their abusers? Psychologists who work with abuse survivors note that this response is actually quite common, especially in cases of long-term familial abuse. The children knew no other reality. Their parents were their entire world. Even in the midst of abuse, there may have been moments of connection, of what felt like love, or what the children were told was love. Additionally, some of the children may have been treated differently than others. In large families with systematic abuse, parents often play favorites, creating a hierarchy among the children. Those who experienced less severe abuse or who found ways to please their parents may have genuinely positive memories alongside the traumatic ones. There's also the simple fact that these young adults are still processing their experiences. Forgiveness may be part of their healing journey, a way to release the anger and hatred that could otherwise consume them. Or their expressions of love for their parents may evolve as they gain distance from the abuse and more fully understand how abnormal their upbringing was. There is no right way for an abuse survivor to feel about their abuser. Some of the Turpin children expressed rage and relief at their parents' imprisonment. Others expressed conflicted feelings of loss and betrayal alongside residual attachment. Both responses and everything in between are valid. As of 2024, the Turpin siblings continue their journey of recovery and adaptation. Some have become advocates for child abuse prevention and homeschooling reform. Several have given media interviews, carefully controlling their own narratives and demonstrating remarkable resilience. They still support each other, maintaining relationships as they build independent lives. Some have pursued education, getting high school equivalency degrees, and even enrolling in community colleges. Others have focused on vocational training and employment. All are learning what it means to be free, to make choices, to experience the world, to define themselves as something other than prisoners in their own home. David and Louise Turpin remain in separate California prisons. They will be elderly if and when they become eligible for parole in 2044. Given the severity of their crimes and the public attention the case received, parole is far from guaranteed. They may well spend the rest of their lives incarcerated, a fate that still seems lenient compared to the decades-long sentences they imposed on their own children. The Turpin case will be remembered not just for the horrific abuse it exposed, but for the questions it raised about how society protects children when abuse happens behind closed doors. It revealed that middle-class respectability can mask monstrous cruelty. It showed that extreme isolation, whether geographic, social, or psychological, can allow abuse to flourish unchecked for decades. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit. 13 people who should have been broken beyond repair are instead rebuilding their lives, learning, growing, and refusing to let their parents' cruelty define them forever. That 17-year-old girl who climbed out the window with a deactivated phone, who risked everything to make that 911 call, she didn't just save herself. She saved her 12 siblings. She exposed a decades-long horror. She proved that even people who have been psychologically controlled and physically imprisoned their entire lives can find the courage to fight for freedom. The Turpin children didn't choose their parents. They didn't ask to be born into a house of horrors. But they're choosing now to be survivors. They're choosing hope over despair, recovery over resignation, life over the slow death their parents had planned for them. And in that choice there is something redemptive, not for David and Louise Turpin, who deserve no redemption, but for the human capacity to heal, to forgive ourselves and sometimes even others, and to insist that we are more than what was done to us. 13 children, decades of abuse, one brave act of escape. And now, lie. A chance at life. Case 3. Timothy Jones, Jr. By most measures, Timothy Ray Jones, Jr. was doing well. At 32 years old, he had a degree in computer engineering from Mississippi State University, and a solid job at Intel in Columbia, South Carolina, earning $71,000 a year, a respectable salary that placed him comfortably in the middle class. He had 5 children: Mara, 8 years old; Elias, 7; Natan, 6; Gabriel, 2; and baby Abigail, just 1 year old. To outsiders, Jones might have looked like any other divorced dad trying to make it work, living in a modest trailer in the Red Bank neighborhood of Lexington County, juggling work and single parenthood after a contentious split from his wife, Amber Kaiser. Sure, the place was a bit messy, and Jones seemed stressed, but what single parent of 5 young children wouldn't be? But on the night of August 28, 2014, Timothy Jones, Jr. didn't just snap under the pressure of parenthood. He systematically murdered all 5 of his children in their home. Then, in an act of cold calculation that would undermine his later claims of insanity, he wrapped their small bodies in bed sheets, loaded them into his Cadillac Escalade, and embarked on an 8-day road trip through 4 states while he decided what to do with the evidence of his horrific crimes. This is the story of how a father became a monster, and how he tried to convince the world he was insane rather than evil. August 28, 2014, started like any other day for Timothy Jones and his 5 children. He had primary custody following his 2013 divorce from Amber, who struggled with her own issues and had limited visitation rights. Jones had convinced the court he was the more stable parent, the one who could provide structure and care. But those who knew the family understood the situation was far from stable. Jones was struggling to maintain his job while caring for 5 young children, essentially alone. The trailer was often dirty, with trash and clutter accumulating. Neighbors occasionally heard yelling. Teachers and daycare workers noticed concerning signs, bruises on the children, comments about being hungry, a father who seemed perpetually on edge. Child Protective Services had been called to investigate twice in the months leading up to the murders. The first time, in May 2014, one of the children told authorities that Jones had spanked him and forced him to do exercises as punishment. But there were no visible bruises, and investigators deemed the punishment to be within the bounds of lawful discipline. Case closed. The second investigation came just weeks before the murders. A report stated, "Mr. Jones beats the child, often leaving bruising. Mr. Jones does not feed the children adequately. It is reported Mr. Jones does not want to send his children back to public schools because he does not want the school to report the beatings." The caseworker noted that, "Dad appears to be overwhelmed as he is unable to maintain the home." That investigation was still open, still incomplete, when Jones decided he couldn't be overwhelmed anymore if he simply eliminated the source of his stress. According to Jones's own confession, which he later recanted parts of, claiming he couldn't remember the details, the killing began with 6-year-old Natan. Jones said he became enraged when Natan broke an electrical outlet in the trailer. It was a minor incident, the kind of accidental damage that happens when young children live in a home. But for Jones, already teetering on the edge, it became the trigger for unspeakable violence. He forced Natan to do physical exercises, what Jones called PTing his ass, until he couldn't handle it anymore. Push-ups, sit-ups, running in place. For a 6-year-old child, it would have been exhausting and frightening. Jones claimed he found his son dead in his bed later, suggesting the boy died from the exertion and possibly from being shaken. But experts would later testify that Natan's death was more sinister than simple exhaustion. The evidence suggested he had been strangled. Whether Jones strangled him during the discipline or after, whether the death was initially accidental or always intentional, these details would become crucial in court. What happened next, however, was unquestionably deliberate. Jones had a dead 6-year-old in his trailer, and rather than call for help, rather than explain it as an accident, rather than face the consequences of his actions, He decided to eliminate the witnesses. He strangled 7-year-old Elias with his bare hands, then 8-year-old Mara. According to testimony from a prison guard who spoke with Jones, the eldest daughter witnessed him murdering one of her brothers and had to be killed to keep her silent. Imagine the terror of that little girl in her moments, understanding what her father was doing, knowing what was coming. 2-year-old Gabriel and 1-year-old Abigail were next. But Jones encountered a problem. Their necks were too small for his adult hands to strangle effectively, so he used a belt, wrapping it around their tiny throats and pulling until they stopped breathing. 5 children, 5 separate acts of murder, each one a conscious decision to end a life he had created. With 5 dead children in his trailer, Timothy Jones, Jr. had to make a decision. He could call 911, confess to what he'd done, and face immediate arrest. Or he could try to cover it up. He chose cover-up. Jones wrapped each small body in bed sheets and blankets. He carried them to his Cadillac Escalade, loading them like cargo into the back of the vehicle. Then he began to drive, with no clear destination, but a desperate need to dispose of the evidence. Over the next 8 days, Jones drove through South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. His Escalade became a mobile tomb, the bodies of his children decomposing in the August heat as he meandered through the South, stopping at stores, eating at restaurants, maintaining a facade of normalcy even as he transported the corpses of his murdered children. But Jones wasn't just driving aimlessly, he was planning. Investigators would later find handwritten notes in his vehicle, a macabre to-do list that revealed the calculated nature of his actions: melt bodies, sand bones to dust or small pieces, burn up bodies. Day 1, burn up bodies. Day 2, sand down bones. Day 3, Mexican border, dissolve, and discard. This was not the writing of someone who had lost touch with reality. This was methodology. This was problem-solving. This was a man trying to literally erase the evidence of his crimes. He went to stores and purchased supplies: goggles, a saw, chemicals, camping equipment, gasoline. Each purchase was another step in his plan to destroy his children's bodies so completely that they could never be identified, so completely that he might never be caught. On September 6, 2014, 8 days after the murders and more than a week into his grim road trip, Timothy Jones, Jr. made a critical mistake. He stopped at a DUI checkpoint in Smith County, Mississippi. The officer who pulled him over immediately noticed something was off. Jones appeared to be under the influence of drugs. The vehicle had a strong odor, not just of marijuana. Jones had been smoking synthetic marijuana called spice, but of something worse, something organic and decaying. A search of the Escalade revealed bloodstains, bleach, drug paraphernalia, and personal items belonging to children, but no children. The officer also found those handwritten notes, the chilling to-do list for body disposal. When confronted, Jones initially tried to maintain the pretense that everything was fine. But as the evidence mounted and the questions intensified, he broke. He admitted what he'd done. He told investigators where to find the bodies. On September 8, 2014, law enforcement officers found 5 black garbage bags in a remote clearing off a dirt road in Wilcox County, Alabama. Inside those bags were the remains of Mara, Elias, Natan, Gabriel, and Abigail Jones, 5 children who should have been starting a new school year, playing with toys, living their lives. Instead, they had been murdered by their father and dumped like trash in the woods. The bodies were badly decomposed after more than a week in the summer heat, some stuffed in the bags with hunting gear and camping supplies, as if Jones had been planning to bury or burn them at a campsite, but never followed through. Medical examiners would later testify that the decomposition was so severe they had difficulty determining exact causes of death, though the evidence supported strangulation. When Timothy Jones, Jr. went on trial in 2019, nearly 5 years after the murders, his defense team faced an almost impossible challenge. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. He had confessed. The bodies had been found where he said they would be. His DNA evidence tied him to the crimes. There was no question that he had killed his children, so the defense pivoted to the only strategy available: insanity. Jones pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, arguing that he had been suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the murders and didn't understand that what he was doing was wrong. His attorneys brought in mental health experts who testified about Jones's troubled childhood, his history of drug use, his deteriorating mental state in the months before the murders. They painted a picture of a man who had been overwhelmed, who had untreated mental health issues, who had snapped under the pressure of single parenthood and spiraled into psychosis. They argued that the Jones who killed his children was not the real Timothy Jones, but a man in the grip of severe psychiatric breakdown. But the prosecution had a devastating counter-argument: those notes. How could a man who was so mentally ill that he didn't know right from wrong also have the presence of mind to plan the disposal of 5 bodies? How could someone in the throes of psychosis write out detailed instructions for destroying evidence, purchase supplies for that purpose, and execute an 8-day cover-up operation? Prosecutor Rick Hubbard argued that Jones knew exactly what he was doing. Tim Jones may love his family, but there's someone he loves more: Tim Jones, Hubbard told the jury. He systematically dismantled the insanity defense, pointing out that Jones had the wherewithal to avoid calling 911, to wrap up the bodies, to drive for days while evading detection, to lie to police initially, all actions that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. The prosecution also highlighted Jones's attempts to blame his son for the poisoning case. Yes, there was also evidence suggesting Jones may have been poisoning someone, though this was a side issue to the murder charges. They showed his pattern of lying, his manipulation, his self-interest. The trial was one of the most emotionally grueling in South Carolina history. It lasted over 3 weeks, with testimony from law enforcement officers who had investigated the scene, medical examiners who had examined the children's remains, mental health experts from both sides, family members, teachers, and Jones himself. Jones took the stand in his own defense, a risky move that his attorneys felt was necessary to humanize him and support the insanity plea. He testified about the night of the murders, claiming that he found Natan dead after the exercise punishment and panicked. He said he didn't remember killing the other children clearly, that he was in a dissociative state, that he wasn't thinking rationally. But under cross-examination, Jones's testimony fell apart. He contradicted himself. He claimed to have no memory of certain events while having vivid recall of others. When confronted with the evidence of his meticulous planning, the notes, the supplies he purchased, the 8 days of evading detection, he struggled to explain how someone who was legally insane could have been so calculating. Travis Presley, a prison guard, testified that Jones had admitted to strangling his eldest daughter after she witnessed him murdering one of her brothers. This testimony was particularly damaging because it showed premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Jones killed Mara specifically to eliminate a witness, a calculated act inconsistent with insanity. Perhaps most devastating was the testimony from the children's mother, Amber Kaiser. She took the stand not once but twice, first during the guilt phase and again during sentencing. Despite her divorce from Jones, despite their contentious custody battle, despite everything, she asked the jury for mercy. She didn't want Jones executed. She said she didn't believe in the death penalty. "If I could personally rip his face off, I would. That's the mama bear in me," she testified. "I do not wish on the Jones family what I felt losing my sons." Jones's own father and grandmother also pleaded for his life, describing his troubled childhood and begging the jury not to sentence him to death. They broke down in tears when asked if he deserved to die. "Oh, God, no," his grandmother said. But the prosecution called teachers and babysitters who testified about the trauma of losing the children they had cared for. One teacher said he was leaving the school where one of the Jones children had attended because of all the memories. The impact statements painted a picture of 5 innocent lives, stolen not by a moment of madness, but by deliberate evil. On June 4, 2019, after more than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict, guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. The jury had rejected the insanity defense entirely. They had concluded that Timothy Jones, Jr. knew what he was doing when he killed his children, that he understood it was wrong, and that he had made conscious choices to murder them and then cover up his crimes. But the trial wasn't over. In South Carolina, when someone is convicted of capital murder, the same jury must then decide whether to recommend death or life in prison. The sentencing phase began immediately. The sentencing phase lasted 8 days and included more emotional testimony from family members on both sides. The defense tried to present mitigating factors: Jones's mental health history, his difficult childhood, the possibility for rehabilitation, the wishes of the children's mother who didn't want him executed. But prosecutor Rick Hubbard wasn't asking for mercy. In his closing arguments, he held up photographs of the children's bodies as they had been found, decomposed, stuffed in garbage bags, discarded in the Alabama woods. If you want to know what Jones thought of Mara and Elias, Natan, Gabriel, and Abigail, you'll have to look in bag 2 like the officers had to do, Hubbard told the jury. If you have any doubt, look in the bags. He argued that Jones had shown no mercy to his children, that he had taken everything from them, their lives, their futures, their dignity and death. Great guys and great dads don't dump their daughters in sewage drains, he said, referencing how Jones had treated his children's remains. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On June 13, 2019, they returned with their recommendation: death. Timothy Ray Jones, Jr. was formally sentenced to death by Judge Eugene Griffith, who set an initial execution date for November 30, 2019. However, due to the automatic appeals process in capital cases, Jones was never at immediate risk of execution. As with all death penalty cases, Jones's conviction and sentence were automatically appealed to the South Carolina Supreme Court. His attorneys raised 8 issues, including claims that the trial court erred in jury selection, the judge improperly refused to instruct the jury on the consequences of a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict, evidence was improperly obtained, relevant mitigating evidence was excluded during sentencing, the admission of autopsy photographs was prejudicial and inflammatory. The most contentious issue on appeal was the admission of those autopsy photographs. Jones's attorneys argued that the images of the children's badly decomposed remains were so horrific and emotionally inflammatory that they prejudiced the jury against him. They claimed the photos had no probative value since the cause of death could be established through testimony, and that showing such disturbing images to the jury essentially guaranteed a death sentence. The prosecution countered that the photographs were relevant evidence showing the condition in which Jones left his children, that his calculated disposal of their bodies, allowing them to decompose in the heat while he drove around for over a week, was itself evidence of his depravity and consciousness of guilt. On March 29, 2023, nearly 9 years after the murders, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued its decision. While the court agreed that the autopsy photographs should not have been admitted and that they were prejudicial, the justices ultimately held that the error was harmless given the overwhelming evidence of Jones's guilt and the aggravating circumstances of his crimes. Justice George C. James, writing for the majority, stated, "While the autopsy photographs should not have been admitted, we properly take note of Jones's calculated efforts to dispose of his children's bodies in a remote area to evade responsibility for what he had done." Were the autopsy photographs horrific, Absolutely. Were they inadmissible under Rule 403? Yes, for the reasons we have explained. However, after weighing the horrific facts of this case against the improper admission of the photographs, we hold the photographs did not contribute to the jury sentence of death. Justice John Cannon. Few wrote a concurring opinion disagreeing with his colleagues about the photos. He argued, "Like the other justices, I have seen and sat with these photographs. It is not possible to describe them. They are literally unbearable." A death penalty trial, however, like a man's heinous murder of his own children, is itself a gruesome business, and even without photographs such as these, evidence of what this man did to his children certainly caused a forceful, emotional reaction from the jury. Few continued. Timothy Ray Jones, Jr. took a long series of planned and deliberate actions, first to murder his own children, then to conceal his vicious crimes, and lie to leave the bodies of his own children for the purpose of having them deteriorate to the condition shown in the photographs. His crimes were unspeakable. His efforts to get away with his crimes were unconscionable. He is despicable. The court upheld both Jones's conviction and his death sentence. As of 2025, Timothy Jones, Jr. remains on death row in South Carolina, awaiting execution. South Carolina has not executed anyone since 2011, and the state has faced challenges obtaining the drugs necessary for lethal injection. A 2021 law added the option of execution by electric chair or firing squad, but legal challenges to these methods continue. Jones may spend decades on death row before any execution is carried out, if it ever is. Meanwhile, South Carolina taxpayers have already spent over $647,000 on his trial alone, not including the costs of incarceration and ongoing appeals. As with many of the cases in this series, the murders of the Jones children raise uncomfortable questions about what could have been done to prevent the tragedy. Child Protective Services had been called twice in the months before the murders. Both times, investigators found evidence of concerning behavior, physical punishment that left marks, inadequate food, an overwhelmed father who was struggling to maintain his home. Yet both times, the response was insufficient. The first investigation closed the case because the physical punishment didn't leave lasting bruises and was deemed within the bounds of legal discipline. The second investigation was still open when Jones killed his children. The caseworker never completed the follow-up that might have revealed the escalating danger. Why? The answers are familiar. Overwhelming caseloads, inadequate training, underfunding of Child Protective Services, difficulty proving abuse when it happens behind closed doors, and a system that prioritizes family unity over aggressive intervention. There is also the uncomfortable reality that Jones didn't fit the profile that typically triggers aggressive CPS response. He was educated, employed, articulate, and capable of presenting himself as a struggling but loving single father. He lived in a mobile home in a rural area where there weren't many watchful eyes. His ex-wife had her own issues that made her seem like the less stable parent. The system gave Jones the benefit of the doubt, and 5 children paid for that doubt with their lives. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Jones case is the disconnect between his claims of loving his children and his actions toward them. Throughout the trial, Jones's attorneys portrayed him as a father who had been devoted to his kids, who had fought for custody because he wanted to be their primary caregiver, who had struggled but tried his best. And there's evidence this wasn't entirely fabricated. Photos and videos played at trial showed Jones with his children at happier times, birthday parties, family outings, moments that looked like normal fatherhood. His father testified that Timothy loved his children and had been a caring dad before the tragedy. But how does that square with forcing a 6-year-old to exercise until he dies? With strangling your 7- and 8-year-olds with your bare hands? With using a belt to strangle a baby? With driving around with their bodies for over a week while you plan how to destroy them completely? The prosecution argued that Jones's version of love was fundamentally narcissistic and self-centered. He loved his children as extensions of himself, as possessions, as things that validated his identity as a father. But when they became burdens, when they threatened his freedom through the CPS investigations, when they demanded more than he wanted to give, his love revealed itself as something much darker. Jones wasn't overwhelmed into madness. He was angry, selfish, and ultimately homicidal. He chose murder over asking for help. He chose cover-up over confession. He chose his own convenience over 5 innocent lives. And then, after all of that, he asked a jury to believe he was too insane to be held fully responsible. They didn't buy it. Neither should we. 5 children are dead. 5 futures erased. 5 people who will never grow up, never graduate, never fall in love, never have children of their own, never contribute to the world in the unique ways each of them might have. Mara was 8, old enough to have dreams and personality and potential. Elias was 7, just starting to really understand the world. Natan was 6, the one who broke the outlet that supposedly triggered the nightmare. Gabriel was 2, barely old enough to form lasting memories. Abigail was 1, a baby who knew nothing but that her father was her world. They trusted him completely, and he betrayed that trust in the most absolute way possible. Their mother, Amber Kaiser, lives with the guilt and grief of having been separated from her children when they needed protection. Their grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all must grapple with the knowledge that someone in their family was capable of this evil. The teachers and babysitters who cared for these children carry the weight of wondering if they could have done more, said more, pushed harder for intervention. And the taxpayers of South Carolina are left funding not only the trial but decades of appeals and incarceration for a man who will likely die of old age on death row rather than by execution. But the greatest cost is the simplest one. 5 children who should be alive aren't. 5 lives taken by the one person who should have protected them above all others. The jury decided Timothy Jones Jr. was not insane. They concluded he knew what he was doing and understood it was wrong. The appellate courts agreed. But understanding someone is legally sane doesn't mean we understand why they did what they did. What goes through a person's mind as they strangle their own children one by one? How does someone write out plans to melt bodies and sand bones to dust? How does a father drive through 4 states with his children's corpses decomposing in his vehicle and still maintain enough composure to interact with store clerks and gas station attendants? These are questions that may never have satisfying answers. Jones himself has offered conflicting accounts, sometimes claiming memory loss, sometimes providing detailed confessions, sometimes blaming others, sometimes taking responsibility only to recant later. Perhaps he is mentally ill, but not legally insane, a distinction that matters in court but doesn't change the outcome for his victims. Perhaps he's a narcissist who couldn't admit failure as a parent. Perhaps he's simply evil in a way that defies clinical diagnosis or rational understanding. What we know for certain is this: Timothy Ray Jones Jr. murdered 5 innocent children who loved and trusted him. He did so deliberately, methodically, and with clear consciousness of what he was doing. He attempted to evade justice through elaborate cover-up efforts, and when caught he tried to use mental illness as an excuse rather than owning the full weight of his actions. The jury saw through it. The courts agreed. And now he waits on death row, not for the insane act of a person who had lost touch with reality, but for the calculated, evil actions of a man who chose murder over responsibility. 5 children, 8 days of driving with their bodies, one father's monstrous choice, and a death sentence that may never be carried out. Case 4. Diane Downs. When emergency room staff at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon saw the blood-spattered car pull up on the night of May 19, 1983, they braced themselves for tragedy. A frantic mother screamed that her 3 children had been shot. Nurses and doctors rushed to the vehicle, finding a scene of horror, 3 small children covered in blood, 2 barely clinging to life, 1 already gone. But as medical personnel worked desperately to save the children, something began to feel wrong about the woman who had brought them in. 27-year-old Diane Downs stood in the emergency room with a gunshot wound to her own left forearm, and her behavior was off. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't demanding updates on her children's conditions. Instead, she calmly recounted her story to anyone who would listen, her affect flat and detached, as if she were describing something she'd seen on television rather than lived through. Dr. Stephen Wilhite, who had rushed back to the hospital when his beeper went off, later recalled his unease. He had just saved 8-year-old Christy's life, and when he went to update Diane on her daughter's condition, her response chilled him. Not one tear. You know, she just asked, "How is she doing?" Not one emotional reaction. And then, in what would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her, Diane made a comment that revealed her true priorities. "Boy, this has really spoiled my vacation. That really ruined my new car." Her daughter Cheryl was dead. Her other 2 children were fighting for their lives. And Diane Downs was worried about her vacation plans and her Nissan's upholstery. Diane's story was dramatic and specific. She told police that she had been driving home on Old Mohawk Road, a rural back road near Springfield, after visiting a friend. It was around 10 p.m., and her 3 children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny, were in the back seat. According to Diane, a bushy-haired stranger had flagged her down, standing in the middle of the dark road. When she stopped, the man approached her vehicle and demanded her car keys. She refused. An argument ensued. Then, inexplicably, the stranger began shooting into the car, hitting all 3 children before shooting Diane in the arm. The man then supposedly ran off into the darkness, leaving Diane and her bleeding children on the side of the road. Diane claimed she then drove her wounded children toward the hospital, though witnesses would later note that she drove at approximately 5 miles per hour, an agonizingly slow pace for someone rushing children with gunshot wounds to emergency care. At first, the story seemed plausible enough to warrant a massive search. Police scoured the area looking for the bushy-haired stranger. They set up roadblocks. They interviewed potential witnesses. They followed every lead. But the more investigators looked at the evidence, the more Diane's story fell apart. Detective Doug Welch and his team at the Lane County Sheriff's Office began to notice inconsistencies immediately. The physical evidence at the scene didn't support Diane's version of events. The blood spatter patterns in the car suggested the children had been shot while the vehicle was stationary, not during a carjacking struggle. There were no signs of another person having been present, no footprints, no shell casings in locations that matched Diane's story, nothing. And then there was Diane herself. Medical staff reported that her demeanor was bizarrely inappropriate. She seemed more interested in chatting with doctors and nurses than in grieving her dead daughter or worrying about her wounded children. She gave media interviews readily, telling her dramatic story with an almost theatrical flair, but never quite mustering the emotional responses one would expect from a mother whose children had just been shot. The more she talked, the more things didn't make any sense, Detective Welch later said. It was as if she thought that if she kept talking enough, that you would believe her. But the real breakthrough came when investigators began digging into Diane's personal life. They discovered she had been having an affair with a married man named Robert Knickerbocker. And Knickerbocker had made it clear to Diane that he did not want to be involved with a woman who had children. He wanted a relationship with Diane, but not with her kids. Diane had become obsessed with Knickerbocker, writing him letters, pursuing him relentlessly, even after he tried to end the relationship. In her mind, the children had become obstacles to the life she wanted, the life with the man she believed she loved. Investigators also found Diane's secret diaries, which revealed the depth of her obsession with Knickerbocker and her view of her children as burdens rather than blessings. The picture that emerged was of a profoundly narcissistic woman who saw her children not as individuals to be loved and protected, but as accessories to her life, and expendable ones at that. While police were building their case, something remarkable was happening in the hospital. 8-year-old Christy Downs, who had initially been expected to die from her injuries, was defying the odds. She had suffered a stroke from the trauma, which impaired her ability to speak, but slowly, painstakingly, she began to recover. Months after the shooting, Christy started to communicate more clearly, and when she was able to tell investigators what had happened that night on Old Mohawk Road, her testimony was devastating. There had been no bushy-haired stranger. Christy remembered being in the back seat with her siblings. She remembered the car pulling over. She remembered her mother turning around. And she remembered her mother shooting them, all 3 of them, at point-blank range with a .22 caliber pistol. "My mom shot me and my brother and sister," Christy would eventually testify in court, her speech still halting from the stroke, but her memory crystal clear. It was the testimony that would seal Diane Downs's fate, a mother contradicted by her own surviving daughter. Evil exposed by innocence. On February 28, 1984, 9 months after the shooting, police arrested Diane Downs and charged her with 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Despite the mounting evidence, Diane maintained her innocence, insisting that a stranger had shot her children and that Christy was confused or had been manipulated by investigators. But Diane had a plan to win over the jury, a strategy so calculated and manipulative that it reveals the depth of her narcissism. Knowing that her trial would begin in May 1984, Diane deliberately became pregnant shortly after her arrest. She seduced a man along her postal route, a casual acquaintance who later expressed shock and disgust when he learned how Diane had used him, and ensured she would be visibly pregnant during her trial. Her reasoning was chilling in its cynicism. If the jury saw her pregnant, they would see her as someone who loved children, someone maternal and nurturing. They would think, how could a woman who loves children enough to get pregnant kill her own kids? The trial began in May 1984 and quickly became a national sensation. Prosecutor Fred Hugi methodically laid out the evidence, the inconsistencies in Diane's story, the forensic evidence that contradicted her claims, the diary entries revealing her obsession with Knickerbocker and her resentment of her children, the testimony of ex-husband Steve Downs about Diane's lack of maternal instincts. Steve Downs testified that Diane treated their children like crap and lacked any real maternal feeling. He described how she would leave the children alone for extended periods, how she showed no interest in their well-being, how she once caught their daughter Cheryl jumping on a bed and told her to stop. When Cheryl asked Steve, "Is there a gun here?" and explained, "I want to kill me. My mom says I'm bad." Steve knew something was profoundly wrong with his ex-wife's relationship with their children. Psychiatric experts testified that Diane exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. One psychiatrist noted, "She shows no remorse. She regards her children with no empathy and as objects or possessions. Any feelings she has for them are superficial and only extend to how they are part of her and her life." But the most powerful testimony came from Christy herself. Despite her speech difficulties from the stroke, despite the trauma of facing her mother in court, despite being only 9 years old, Christy took the stand and told the jury what happened. "Who shot you?" Prosecutor Fred Hugi asked gently. Christy pointed at her mother and said, "My mom." On June 17, 1984, after several days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all charges. Diane Downs had been convicted of murdering her daughter Cheryl and attempting to murder Christy and Danny. The judge sentenced her to life in prison plus 50 years, life for the murder, 25 years for each attempted murder count. She would be required to serve at least 25 years before becoming eligible for parole, and the judge made it clear in his sentencing remarks that he did not intend for Diane Downs to ever be free again. Between the verdict and sentencing, the court recessed for a shocking reason. Diane Downs, who had been pregnant throughout the trial as part of her cynical manipulation strategy, gave birth to a daughter whom she named Amy Elizabeth. The child was immediately taken from Diane and placed with adoptive parents Chris and Jackie Babcock, who renamed her Rebecca. Rebecca Babcock would grow up not knowing the full horror of her origins until she was old enough to understand. Today she has spoken publicly about the strange burden of being the daughter that Diane Downs conceived and gave birth to while being prosecuted for murdering her other daughter. Diane Downs was initially incarcerated at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center in Salem. For 3 years, she served her sentence without major incident, maintaining her innocence and working on appeals. But on July 11, 1987, she did something that proved just how dangerous she truly was. Diane scaled an 18-foot razor wire fence surrounding the prison and escaped. For 10 days, she evaded capture in what became a 14-state manhunt. Her face was on the news constantly. Law enforcement feared she might try to track down Christy and Danny to eliminate the witnesses who had testified against her. Security around the children was increased dramatically. Diane had escaped to the home of Wayne Cipher, the husband of a fellow inmate. Cipher, who was addicted to heroin at the time and separated from his wife, later said he knew Diane was on the run but didn't turn her in, a decision he described as one of the worst of his life. "I was dumbfounded when I heard it," said Detective Doug Welch when he learned of the escape. "When it came my time to burn, I was just going to tell the truth and get it over with," Cipher later said about why he eventually cooperated with police. On July 21, 1987, Diane was recaptured just blocks from the prison. She was sentenced to an additional 5 years for the escape and immediately transferred to the New Jersey Department of Corrections Clinton Correctional Facility for women. The transfer came after heavy lobbying from prosecutor Fred Hugi, who had done something remarkable after the trial. He and his wife Joanne had adopted Christy and Danny Downs. Hugi argued successfully that having Diane incarcerated just 66 miles from his home in Springfield posed too great a risk to the children if she escaped again. Oregon agreed to transfer her out of state. Fred Hugi's decision to adopt Christy and Danny Downs is one of the most extraordinary aspects of this case. As the prosecutor who secured their mother's conviction, Hugi had spent months working with these traumatized children, hearing their stories, witnessing their courage. Christy's testimony had been crucial to the conviction, and Hugi had seen firsthand how intelligent, brave, and resilient both surviving children were despite everything their mother had done to them. Christy, despite her stroke-induced speech disability, went on to live a full life. She married and had children of her own, including a daughter whom she named Cheryl in memory of her murdered sister. Danny, paralyzed from the waist down by his mother's bullet, learned to navigate life with a disability and also built a life for himself. The Hugi family provided them with the stability, love, and normalcy they had been denied by their biological mother. It's a reminder that even in the darkest cases, there can be redemption, not for the perpetrator, but for the survivors who refuse to let evil define them. After her escape and recapture, Diane Downs was transferred to California, where she has remained incarcerated for decades. She earned an associate degree while in prison and, according to prison records, has generally followed institutional rules aside from the escape incident. In 1994, she was transferred to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. In 2010, she was moved to the Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California, though she was transferred again when that facility was converted to an all-male institution in 2013. Diane became eligible for parole in 2008 after serving 25 years. Her first parole hearing was highly anticipated, with many wondering if she would lie, show remorse, or admit her guilt. She did neither. Diane maintained her innocence, continued to claim that a bushy-haired stranger had shot her children, and presented herself as a victim of a miscarriage of justice. The parole board was not impressed. They denied her release, noting, "Her previous violence occurred in the context of her care of vulnerable children for some purpose that has not yet been fully understood due to her denial of responsibility." In other words, until she admits what she did and why, she remains a danger. She was denied parole again in 2010 and again in 2020. Each time the board reached the same conclusion: Diane Downs has not taken responsibility for her crimes, shows no genuine remorse, and continues to pose a risk to public safety. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for 2030. Over the years, Diane Downs has developed increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories to explain her wrongful conviction. Her claims have become so delusional that they raise questions about her mental state. In petitions and communications from prison, Diane has claimed that her newborn footprint appeared in a 1964 World Book Encyclopedia entry on page 321 of Volume F before she was born, implying some kind of FBI conspiracy. She has claimed that her palm print appeared in a 1967 book when she was only a child, again suggesting governmental manipulation of her case. She has claimed that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was somehow involved in her case. Her brother, James Fredrickson, maintains his sister's innocence and has created social media pages dedicated to proving she was wrongly convicted. "Diane may die in prison, but I promised my dad the truth wouldn't die with her," he writes on Facebook. But the evidence against Diane was overwhelming, and her conspiracy theories only reinforce what psychiatric experts testified to at trial. She is a narcissist incapable of accepting responsibility, someone who will create any alternative reality rather than confront the truth of what she did. The Diane Downs case captured national attention in the 1980s and has remained in the public consciousness ever since. True crime writer Ann Rule wrote a definitive book about the case titled Small Sacrifices, published in 1987, which became a bestseller and is still considered one of the finest works of true crime literature. In 1989, the book was adapted into a television movie starring Farrah Fawcett as Diane Downs. Fawcett's portrayal earned critical acclaim, and the movie brought the case to an even wider audience. The performance captured Diane's narcissism, her manipulative charm, and her fundamental lack of genuine emotion, the flatness beneath the theatrical displays. The case is frequently studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of extreme narcissistic personality disorder and filicide motivated by romantic obsession. It's also used in law enforcement training as a case study in detecting deception. Diane's over-explanation, her inappropriate affect, her focus on trivial details when discussing tragedy were all red flags that investigators learned to recognize. While Diane Downs sits in prison, maintaining her innocence and weaving conspiracy theories, the real victims and survivors of her crimes have tried to build lives from the wreckage she left. Cheryl Lynn Downs never got the chance to grow up. She died at age 7, shot by her mother on a dark road. She's buried in a cemetery in Oregon, her grave a permanent reminder of a life stolen far too soon. Christy Downs, despite her stroke and the trauma of what her mother did, survived and thrived. She overcame her speech disability enough to testify at trial and has gone on to live a private life with her adoptive family. She has children of her own now, including that daughter named for her murdered sister, a beautiful act of remembrance and reclamation. Danny Downs, paralyzed from the waist down by his mother's bullet, has also built a life for himself. He learned to adapt to his disability, and, like his sister, has chosen to live privately, away from the media attention that still periodically focuses on their mother. Both surviving children have made it clear over the years that they want nothing to do with Diane Downs. They have no interest in prison visits, no desire for reconciliation, no willingness to entertain her claims of innocence. They know the truth. They lived it, and they've moved on without her. The Diane Downs case is often cited in discussions of maternal filicide, mothers who kill their children. Researchers have identified several categories of such cases, and Diane fits clearly into the unwanted child category, described by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Philip Resnick. These are cases where mothers kill their children not out of psychosis or mercy, but because the children have become obstacles to the life they want. The children interfere with romantic relationships, career opportunities, or freedom. Unlike the altruistic filicide seen in cases like Andrea Yates, who believed she was saving her children from hell, there is no delusional belief system at work, just cold calculation and narcissistic self-interest. What makes Diane's case particularly chilling is the premeditation involved. This wasn't a moment of impulse. She planned it. She drove them to an isolated location. She shot each child deliberately. She then shot herself to create a cover story. She drove slowly to the hospital to ensure her story would be believed. And throughout it all, she focused on her own narrative, her own image, her own desires. Diane Downs loved only one person, Diane Downs. Her children were never individuals to her, never people with their own worth and humanity. They were possessions, accessories, obstacles, and ultimately disposable. Is Diane Downs evil, mentally ill, or both? The psychiatric experts at trial diagnosed her with multiple personality disorders, but they also concluded she was legally sane. She knew what she was doing and understood it was wrong. She wasn't hearing voices commanding her to kill. She wasn't in the grip of postpartum psychosis. She wasn't having a psychotic break. She simply wanted her children gone so she could pursue a relationship with a man who didn't want kids. And she was willing to murder them to get what she wanted. That's not mental illness in the clinical sense that absolves responsibility. That's evil, the conscious choice to harm the innocent for selfish gain, the ability to look your children in the face and pull the trigger, the capacity to complain about your ruined car while your daughter bleeds out in the back seat. Diane Downs had empathy. She just reserved it entirely for herself. She felt sorry for how her life had turned out, for the obstacles in her way, for the inconvenience of being caught and punished. But for her children? Nothing. Even decades later, she has never expressed genuine remorse or acknowledged the suffering she caused. As of 2025, Diane Downs is 73 years old and incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She has been denied parole 3 times and will not be eligible to apply again until 2030. If she lives to that hearing, she will be 85 years old. Given her continued refusal to accept responsibility for her crimes, it's highly unlikely she will ever be released. The parole board has made it clear. Until she stops lying, stops creating conspiracy theories, and honestly confronts what she did, she will remain where she is. She maintains a website, managed by supporters, filled with her conspiracy theories and claims of innocence. She continues to write to anyone who will listen, insisting she was framed, manipulated, wrongly convicted. She has never, in over 40 years, admitted the truth that her daughter Christy told the world. My mom shot me. Meanwhile, Christy and Danny Downs live their lives far from the spotlight, raising their own families, working, finding joy where they can. They don't talk about their mother to the press anymore. They've said everything that needs to be said. They survived her, and that, in itself, is a triumph. The Diane Downs case endures in true crime history, not because of its complexity or mystery. The facts are straightforward, the evidence overwhelming, but because it confronts us with a truth we find almost unbearable, that some mothers are capable of looking at their children and seeing nothing worth saving. We want to believe that maternal love is universal, instinctive, unbreakable. We want to believe that whatever else might go wrong in the world, a mother's love for her children is constant. The Diane Downs case shatters that comforting illusion. Diane Downs chose a man she barely knew, a man who didn't even want a serious relationship with her, over the 3 children she had given birth to and raised. She chose freedom over responsibility. She chose herself over everyone else. And when her children became obstacles, she eliminated them with the same casual calculation someone might use to cancel a subscription or sell a car. 7-year-old Cheryl Lynn paid for her mother's selfishness with her life. Christy paid with a stroke that affected her speech and years of trauma. Danny paid with his ability to walk and a childhood stolen by violence and recovery. And all 3 paid with the knowledge that the person who was supposed to love and protect them above all others was the person who pulled the trigger. Diane Downs will likely die in prison. She will die lying, die insisting she's innocent, die wrapped in conspiracy theories and delusions rather than facing the truth of what she did. But Christy and Danny Downs will live. They have already outlived their mother's crime. They have built lives, loved people, raised children who will grow up knowing that sometimes the worst evil comes from the people who should love us most, and that's surviving. Such evil is its own form of heroism. My mom shot me, 3 words that destroyed a mother's lie, and 3 words that will echo forever as a testament to a child's courage. Case 5, Joel Guy Jr. Family photos of Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy smiling together. Thanksgiving 2016. A time for gratitude, family, and coming together. But in a quiet Knoxville, Tennessee neighborhood, one son had different plans for the holiday weekend. Plans that would transform a family reunion into one of the most grotesque murder scenes investigators had ever witnessed. Dark screen with date. November 26, 2016. Joel Guy Jr. was 28 years old, but he'd never really grown up. For an entire decade, he'd drifted through college, first George Washington University, then Louisiana State University, never graduating, never working, never contributing. His parents, Joel Sr. and Lisa, had funded every failed semester, every lazy year, every empty promise that this time would be different. Joel Sr., 61, was a pipeline engineering designer, a man who'd built a career through hard work and dedication. Lisa, 55, worked as a human resources administrator at Jacobs Engineering in Oak Ridge. They'd been married for 31 years. They'd earned their retirement. And as Thanksgiving 2016 approached, they'd made a decision. It was time for their son to stand on his own 2 feet. They were planning to retire, planning to stop the money train, planning to cut Joel Jr. off from the financial support he'd depended on his entire adult life. Joel Jr. had a different plan. Starting weeks before Thanksgiving, Joel Guy Jr. began shopping. But he wasn't buying groceries for a family feast. Surveillance cameras captured him at multiple stores: Ace Hardware, Home Depot, Academy Sports, Walmart. He paid cash. He used self-checkout. He was careful, calculated. His shopping list? Knives, blue plastic storage tubs, muriatic acid, hydrogen peroxide, bleach, drain opener, a spray bottle, gloves, trash bags, and he wrote it all down. In a notebook that prosecutors would later call the Book of Premeditation, Joel Jr. detailed his sick plan with chilling specificity. The list included items needed: killing knives, carving knives, camping supplies, gas, acid, and tasks to complete: melt bodies, sand bones to dust or small pieces, burn up bodies, exterior of family home, evidence photos, non-graphic. On Thanksgiving weekend, Joel Jr. drove from his Baton Rouge apartment to visit his parents in their Knoxville home. The family shared a pizza dinner. His parents had no idea they were serving their last meal to their own executioner. What happened next was so brutal, so methodical, so cold-blooded that even seasoned detectives struggled to process it. Joel Guy Sr. was stabbed 42 times. The knife damaged his lungs, liver, and kidneys. Some wounds were so deep they scraped through his ribs, cutting clean through bone. A piece of broken knife blade was found embedded in his shoulder. His hands were severed. His arms were cut off at the shoulder blades. Lisa Guy was stabbed at least 31 times. Like her husband, she fought for her life and lost. But Joel Jr. wasn't finished, not even close. Crime scene diagram, courtroom footage. He dismembered both bodies with surgical precision. According to forensic anthropologist Dr. Murray Marks, who testified at trial, disarticulating bodies at the joints requires substantial time and effort. Joel Jr. spent hours in that house of horrors, sawing through bone and tissue, separating his parents into pieces. He placed their torsos and limbs in large blue plastic tubs, the same ones he'd been caught on camera buying weeks earlier. Then he filled the tubs with chemicals: muriatic acid, hydrogen peroxide, bleach, lye, drain cleaner. Prosecutors described the mixture as a diabolical stew of human remains designed to dissolve flesh and bone until nothing identifiable remained. But the most horrific detail: Lisa Guy's severed head was found in a pot on the stove. It had been boiling for over a day by the time police discovered it. Joel Sr.'s hands were left on the hallway floor, severed and discarded. Body camera footage from police discovery Joel Jr.'s plan was interrupted. During the attack, he'd been injured, likely cut during the frenzied stabbing. He left the partially dissolved remains at the house and drove away to treat his wounds. He was planning to return. But Lisa Guy's co-worker noticed she didn't show up for work the Monday after Thanksgiving. Concerned, the co-worker called for a welfare check. When deputies arrived at 11434 Golden View Lane on November 28, 2016, they found a door unlocked. What they discovered inside would haunt them forever. The smell hit them first, a toxic combination of chemical fumes and decomposition. They saw blood, then the hands on the floor, then they looked down the hallway and saw the blue tubs in the bathroom. One officer later testified they needed hazmat equipment just to process the scene. The Knox County Sheriff's Office Forensics Unit worked through the entire night and into the next day. The FBI was called in. East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office assisted. Mugshot of Joel Guy Jr., arrest footage. Joel Guy Jr. was arrested quickly. In his Baton Rouge apartment, investigators found all the evidence they needed: the clothes he'd worn, the notebook with his murder plan, receipts from his shopping trips, even his LSU student materials, reminders of the education his parents had funded while he plotted their deaths. Courtroom ambiance. At trial in October 2020, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw the book of premeditation. They watched surveillance footage of Joel Jr. buying murder supplies. They heard about his motive: a $500,000 life insurance policy he'd inherit if both parents died or went missing. They heard from his half-sisters who testified that their father and Lisa were wonderful people who loved Joel Jr. so much. One sister, Michelle Tyler, told the court, "I know I will never be able to forgive my half-brother for the trauma he caused this family." Another, Sister Chandas Fink, said simply, "They were larger than life. They were so happy and such really good people, and they loved him. They loved him so much." Judge Steve Sword, at sentencing Joel Guy Jr., showed no remorse. During cross-examination, when prosecutors gave him one chance to explain what happened, he replied dismissively, "I already stated what happened to Sharon," referring to himself in the third person as if discussing someone else's crime. Judge Steve Sword didn't hold back during sentencing. "He's not as intelligent as he thinks he is," the judge stated, looking directly at Joel Jr. "This case represents the most extreme form of abuse of a corpse I've seen in my 25-year career." The judge called the crimes pure evil overkill. On October 2, 2020, Joel Guy Jr. was convicted on all 7 counts: 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder, 3 counts of felony murder, and 2 counts of abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with an additional 4 years for the corpse abuse charges, all to run consecutively. He won't be eligible for release for 130 years. Judge Sword made it clear 300 years isn't enough time to reasonably relate to what this defendant did. Current prison facility exterior today. Joel Guy Jr. sits in the Northwest Correctional Complex in Tiptonville, Tennessee. In 2023, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals denied his appeal, which had argued that police lacked legal grounds to search the property. The court disagreed emphatically. He never got that $500,000 life insurance payout. He never got his parents' house. He never got away with it. What he did get was exactly what he deserved. But the real tragedy isn't just that Joel Guy Jr. will die in prison. The real tragedy is what was lost. Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy weren't just victims in a crime statistic. They were people who worked hard, built a life together, and loved their children, including the son who would ultimately betray them in the most horrific way imaginable. They planned to enjoy their retirement, to lie rest after decades of work and sacrifice. They supported their son for 10 years, 10 years of tuition payments, 10 years of rent, 10 years of believing he would eventually find his way. Instead of gratitude, they received 73 stab wounds between them. Instead of a Thanksgiving dinner to remember, their son gave them a death so brutal that investigators needed therapy to cope with what they'd witnessed. Lisa's brother, Alvin Madere Jr., testified at trial that their mother, Joel Sr., and Lisa's grandmother, entered the hospital just days after the murders. She died the day after the funeral. The loss of her child was difficult for her, Madere said through tears, one that I hope I never have to endure. But to find out your daughter was murdered by her own grandchild was heartbreaking. I believe my mother died of a broken heart. The Knoxville home where Joel Sr. and Lisa Guy died has since been sold. The new owners had no idea of its history when they moved in. The blue tubs, the boiling pot, the chemical stew, all of it was cleaned, removed, erased from the physical space. But the memory remains. The evidence remains sealed in court records. 700 pieces of evidence, 27 witnesses, 4 days of testimony. The book of premeditation remains as proof that Joel Guy Jr. didn't just snap in a moment of rage. He planned this. He prepared. He wanted this. And when it was over, when his parents lay dead and dismembered in that house, Joel Guy Jr. didn't break down in remorse. He didn't call 911. He didn't confess. He ran. Courtroom footage. Sentencing moment District Attorney Sharm Allen said after the verdict, "This case was horrific for the family to experience. The citizens of Knox County can rest easier tonight knowing that our criminal justice process worked effectively to remove Joel Guy Jr. from our community. But for the family left behind, the sisters who lost their father and stepmother, the grandmother who died of grief, the friends and co-workers who knew Joel Sr. and Lisa as kind, generous people, there is no resting easier. There is only the knowledge that someone they loved, someone they supported, someone they raised and nurtured, looked at them and saw only dollar signs. Joel Guy Sr., 61 years old Lisa Guy, 55 years old, married 31 years, murdered by their son for money. The cruelty of Joel Guy Jr. shocks us because of its calculation, its cold planning, its utter lack of humanity. But our next case presents a different kind of horror, not a son who killed for money, but a mother who killed for love, or so she claimed. Case 6, Susan Smith, October 25, 1994, Union, South Carolina. A small mill town where everybody knows everybody, where neighbors look out for each other, where nothing truly terrible ever seems to happen, until it did. Susan Smith's tearful press conference footage. At 9:12 p.m. that Tuesday night, A frantic 911 call came in. A young mother, her voice shaking with apparent terror, reported that her car had been stolen, with her 2 babies still inside. "A black man has got my kids and my car," she sobbed to the dispatcher. Her name was Susan Smith. She was 23 years old. And for 9 days she would captivate and horrify an entire nation with a lie so calculated, so cruel, so cynically racist that even seasoned investigators couldn't believe someone could be that cold. But the worst part? The lie was covering up something far more evil. Photos of Michael and Alexander Smith. Michael Daniel Smith was 3 years old, a little boy with a bright smile and his whole life ahead of him. His baby brother, Alexander Tyler, was just 14 months old, still in diapers, still learning to walk, still completely dependent on the mother who was supposed to protect him. On the night of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith buckled both boys into their car seats in her burgundy 1990 Mazda Protégé. Michael and Alex were already in their pajamas, drowsy and ready for bed. They trusted their mother completely. And she drove them to their deaths. John D. Long Lake sits just outside Union, South Carolina. It's a quiet spot, surrounded by trees, the kind of place where locals fish on summer afternoons. The boat ramp slopes gently into the dark water. Susan Smith knew this place well. Around 9 p.m. that October evening, she pulled her Mazda up to the boat ramp. Her sons were asleep in the back seat, strapped securely into their car seats. She put the car in neutral. She released the emergency brake, and she got out. The car rolled slowly down the ramp and into the lake. It didn't sink immediately. It floated for a few minutes, windows above water, giving anyone inside time to realize what was happening, time to scream, time to panic. But Michael and Alex were strapped in. They were 3 years old and 14 months old. They couldn't unbuckle themselves. They couldn't open the doors. They couldn't swim. They could only drown. The car came to rest upside down on the lake bottom, 18 feet below the surface. Michael and Alex died slowly, trapped in their car seats, in the dark, in the cold water, as their mother watched from the shore. Then Susan Smith got to work on her performance. She drove to a nearby house and banged on the door, hysterical. When Union County Sheriff Howard Wells arrived at the scene, Susan told him a terrifying story. She'd been driving toward her home in the Monarch Mills area, she said, when she stopped at a red light at the intersection of Highway 49 and Monarch Road. A black man stepped out of the darkness and into the street. He was wearing a knit cap, she said. He had a gun. He jumped into her car, held the gun to her side, and ordered her to drive. She begged him not to hurt her. She told him about her babies in the back seat. But the carjacker didn't care, she claimed. He ordered her out of the car at John D. Long Lake, then drove away with Michael and Alex still inside, taking her babies into the night. Massive search operation footage, volunteers, news crews. America's heart broke. Within hours, the story had gone national. News crews descended on Union, South Carolina. Volunteers organized massive search parties. The FBI joined the investigation. Bloodhounds tracked scents. Helicopters scoured the countryside. Police set up roadblocks and searched every vehicle. Everyone was looking for a black man in a knit cap, driving a burgundy Mazda with 2 precious babies inside. Susan Smith at press conferences, holding teddy bears. And Susan Smith played her role perfectly. She appeared on national television, sobbing, begging for her children's safe return. She clutched teddy bears. She made desperate pleas to the kidnapper. "I can't even describe what I'm going through," she told reporters, her voice breaking. "My children needed me, and I can't help them." She described Michael and Alex in loving detail, how Michael liked to sing, how baby Alex was just starting to talk. She said she prayed every minute for their safe return. The nation watched. The nation prayed. The nation searched. And Susan Smith knew exactly where her sons were, dead at the bottom of John D. Long Lake, right where she'd left them. Investigation footage, Sheriff Wells. But Sheriff Howard Wells had doubts from the beginning. Susan's story had problems, big problems. First, the traffic light where she claimed to have stopped. It didn't exist. There was a stop sign at that intersection, not a light. It was a small detail, but Susan insisted she'd been stopped at a red light. Second, her description of the carjacker kept changing. First, he was wearing a knit cap. Then, it was a different kind of hat. His clothing changed in each retelling. Third, and most damning, her demeanor was off. Investigators who've worked with parents of missing children know what real grief looks like. It's raw, uncontrolled, consuming. Susan Smith's tears seemed performative. She could turn them on and off. When she thought cameras weren't watching, her face went blank. Polygraph test facility, investigation room. Susan failed a polygraph test, then another. On November 3rd, 9 days after Michael and Alex disappeared, Sheriff Wells brought Susan Smith in for another interview. He looked her in the eye and asked her directly, "Susan, where are your children?" And lie. The dam broke. Susan Smith's confession footage, courthouse through tears, real ones this time, Susan Smith confessed. There was no carjacker. There was no black man in a knit cap. There never had been. She had killed her own children. But why? The truth was even uglier than the lie. Susan Smith had been having an affair with Tom Findley, the son of her boss at the local mill, a wealthy, handsome man from one of Union's most prominent families. Susan was infatuated with him. She saw him as her ticket to a better life. But Tom Findley didn't want children. He'd made that clear. Just days before the murders, he'd written Susan a letter ending their relationship. The reason? Her kids. "I don't want children," he wrote, "and you have children. I'm sorry, but that's just the way I feel." Susan Smith read that letter and made a decision. If Tom Findley didn't want a woman with children, then she would eliminate the problem, not by giving Michael and Alex to their father in a custody arrangement, not by letting Tom go and focusing on being a mother, by drowning her children in a lake. At trial, prosecutors laid out the case methodically. They presented the timeline: Tom Findley's rejection letter, Susan's deteriorating emotional state, her detailed knowledge of John D. Long Lake, her calculated drive to the boat ramp. They proved that Susan had buckled her children into their car seats, ensuring they couldn't escape. They showed that she'd stood on the shore and watched as her car, with her babies trapped inside, sank beneath the surface. They demonstrated that she'd then driven to a house, fabricated an entire story about a black carjacker, and launched a massive manhunt that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and traumatized an entire community. Recovery of vehicle from lake. When divers pulled the Mazda from John D. Long Lake on November 3, 1994, they found Michael and Alex exactly where their mother had left them, still strapped in their car seats, submerged in the dark. The image of that car being lifted from the water pouring from the windows, became seared into America's consciousness. Everyone knew what was inside. Diverse community reactions, African American leaders speaking. And then there was the racial dimension of Susan Smith's lie. By accusing a fictional black man of kidnapping her children, Susan had weaponized one of America's oldest and most dangerous racist tropes, the black male criminal preying on innocent white women and children. In 1994, the country was still reeling from decades of racial tension. Just 3 years earlier, the Rodney King beating and subsequent LA riots had exposed deep wounds. The O.J. Simpson trial was dominating headlines. And here was Susan Smith, deliberately exploiting racial fear to cover her own crimes. African American leaders across the country condemned her false accusation. They pointed out that countless black men had been lynched, imprisoned, or killed based on exactly these kinds of lies. White women falsely accusing black men of crimes they didn't commit. For 9 days, police had been searching for a black male suspect. For 9 days, black men in Union and surrounding areas were viewed with suspicion. For 9 days, Susan Smith's lie reinforced every ugly stereotype. Trial footage, Susan Smith crying. When the trial began in July 1995, Susan Smith's defense team argued for mercy. They presented evidence of her troubled childhood, her stepfather's sexual abuse, her history of suicide attempts, her depression. They argued that she'd intended to die with her children, that she'd planned to drive into the lake herself, but lost her nerve at the last moment. The prosecution countered that this was unwanted child filicide. Susan Smith had simply wanted to be free of her children so she could pursue Tom Findlay. Everything else was manipulation. The jury deliberated for less than 2.5 hours. Courtroom verdict guilty on both counts of murder. But in the sentencing phase, after hearing testimony from Susan's family and considering her troubled past, the jury made a controversial decision. They spared her life. On July 28, 1995, Susan Smith was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Current prison facility, Susan Smith is inmate, Chapter 68572, at the Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood, South Carolina. She's been there for nearly 30 years. In March 2010, she appeared before the parole board for the first time. Judge William Howard, who presided over her trial, submitted a letter opposing her release. Michael and Alex's father, David Smith, appeared to beg the board to keep her behind bars. The parole board denied her request unanimously. And in November 2024, as this documentary is being produced, Susan Smith will be eligible for parole again. 30 years will have passed since she murdered her children. David Smith, speaking at parole hearings, Michael and Alex's father, has never remarried. He spent 3 decades living with the knowledge that the woman he once loved murdered his children. He's testified at every parole hearing, and he's promised to testify at every future hearing until Susan Smith dies in prison. She had 9 days to think about those babies being missing, he said at the 2010 parole hearing. 9 days to think about what she'd done, and she never told the truth until she had no choice. That's not remorse. That's getting caught. Susan Smith didn't kill because she was psychotic like Andrea Yates. She didn't kill in a rage like Mitchell Blair. She didn't kill for insurance money like Joel Guy Jr. She killed for convenience. She killed because her children were an obstacle to the life she wanted. She killed because Tom Findlay didn't want kids, and she wanted Tom Findlay more than she wanted to be a mother. Photos of Michael and Alex. Michael Daniel Smith would be 33 years old today. He might have graduated college, started a career, maybe had children of his own. Alexander Tyler Smith would be 31. He never got to experience his first day of kindergarten, his first date, his first job, his first anything beyond his first year of life. They died because their mother valued a relationship with a man who didn't even love her more than she valued their lives. John D. Long Lake Memorial. Today, there's a small memorial at John D. Long Lake, a simple stone marker where Michael and Alex died. People still leave flowers there, teddy bears, notes to 2 little boys who never got to grow up. The lake looks peaceful now. The water is calm. The trees rustle in the breeze. But beneath that calm surface lies a darkness that Union, South Carolina, has never fully recovered from. Archival footage of the search, then Susan's confession. For 9 days, America searched for 2 missing children and a black carjacker who never existed. For 9 days, volunteers scoured the countryside, hoping against hope to find Michael and Alex alive. For 9 days, Susan Smith played the grieving mother while her sons lay dead at the bottom of a lake. And when the truth lie came out, it wasn't just the murder that shocked the nation. It was the coldness of it, the calculation, the manipulation, the willingness to destroy not just her own children's lives, but to weaponize racism and trauma to cover her tracks. News headlines from 1994. Susan Smith became America's first true murder mom of the media age, before Andrea Yates, before Casey Anthony, before any of the others who would follow. Her case became a template for how we understand mothers who kill, but it also became something else, a stark reminder that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a 23-year-old woman with tears in her eyes, begging for her children's safe return while knowing they're already dead. Sometimes evil looks like a mother. Michael Daniel Smith, age 3, Alexander Tyler Smith, age 14, months drowned by their mother, October 25, 1994. I will never forget the feeling of helplessness I had when I found out my sons were gone. David Smith, Father Susan Smith, killed her children to pursue a romantic relationship. Our next case involves a mother who killed for very different reasons that would spark a national debate about mental illness, responsibility, and the fine line between evil and madness. Case 7, Andrea Yates, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, Mary, 5 children, 5 beautiful lives, 5 names that would become synonymous with one of the most heartbreaking tragedies in American criminal history. On June 20, 2001, in a suburban Houston home, a mother systematically drowned all 5 of her children in the family bathtub. But unlike every other case we've examined, this mother was fighting an invisible enemy, one that doctors had warned about, one that medication could have controlled, one that her family and the medical system failed to take seriously until it was far too late. This is the story of Andrea Yates, and it forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. Where does mental illness end and criminal responsibility begin? Andrea Pia Kennedy was born August 7, 1955. She wasn't always the hollow-eyed woman we'd see in courtroom footage. She was her high school's valedictorian, bright, accomplished, ambitious. She became a registered nurse, a profession that requires intelligence, compassion, and the ability to care for others. In 1993, she married Russell "Rusty" Yates, a NASA engineer. They were devout Christians who believed in traditional family values. They wanted a large family. They wanted to serve God. Andrea was 28 when they married. Within 8 years, she would give birth to 5 children. And within that same 8 years, her mind would slowly, steadily, catastrophically fall apart. Medical records, hospital footage. The warning signs weren't subtle. They were screaming red flags that doctors documented, flagged, and begged the family to heed. After the birth of her 4th child, Luke, in 1999, Andrea experienced her first major psychotic break. She stopped eating, she stopped talking, she scratched bald spots into her own scalp. She had visions, she heard voices. On June 16, 1999, she attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. The next day she tried again, this time holding a knife to her own throat. Andrea was hospitalized at Devereux, Texas Treatment Network, where psychiatrists diagnosed her with major depression with psychotic features. This wasn't just postpartum depression, the baby blues that many new mothers experience. This was severe mental illness with hallucinations and delusional thinking. Prescription bottles, medical charts, doctors prescribed antipsychotic medication. Andrea improved. The hallucination stopped. She could function again, care for her children, be a mother. But then something happened that would seal the fate of 5 innocent children. Andrea and Rusty Yates were followers of a fundamentalist Christian preacher named Michael Warren-Yecke, who taught that women who failed in their duties as mothers would burn in hell and their children would be eternally damned. Warren-Yecke preached that bad mothers created bad children and bad children were agents of Satan. Andrea internalized this teaching. It festered in her mind like a poison. And despite multiple psychiatric hospitalizations, despite suicide attempts, despite doctors explicitly warning that another pregnancy could trigger a catastrophic psychotic episode, Andrea Yates became pregnant again. On November 30th, 2000, she gave birth to her fifth child, a daughter she named Mary. Almost immediately, Andrea's mental state deteriorated. The depression returned, the hallucinations returned, the visions of Satan returned. In March 2001, she took a handful of sleeping pills, another suicide attempt. She was hospitalized again at Devereux. Doctors warned that she was at extreme risk. They prescribed the antipsychotic medication Haldol, which helped stabilize her. But in early June 2001, Andrea's psychiatrist, Dr. Mohammed Saeed, decided to change her medication regimen. He discontinued the Haldol despite the fact that it was working. His reasoning was that Andrea seemed to be doing better. She wasn't. On June 18, 2001, just 2 days before the murders, Andrea had an appointment with Dr. Saeed. She sat in his office, barely responsive, clearly in crisis. He noted her condition, but sent her home anyway. 2 days later, Rusty Yates left for work at 9 a.m., leaving Andrea alone with all 5 children for the first time in months. What happened next took place over the course of approximately 1 hour. Exterior of Yates' home, bathtub, stock footage, not crime scene. Andrea Yates went to the family bathroom. She plugged the drain. She turned on the water and let the bathtub fill, not all the way, but enough. Then she went to get her children. The psychological evaluation tapes released to primetime in 2006 captured Andrea describing what she did in her own flat, emotionless voice. She started with Paul, age 3. She carried him to the bathroom, placed him in the tub face down, and held him under the water until he stopped struggling. It took several minutes. Paul fought. He didn't understand why his mother was hurting him. Andrea laid Paul's small body on the bed, his wet hair soaking into the sheets. Then she got Luke, age 2, the same process, into the water, face down, held under until the struggling stopped. Luke's body joined Paul's on the bed. Then came John, age 5. John was old enough to understand danger. He saw his brothers' bodies. He knew something was terribly wrong. He tried to run. Andrea caught him, dragged him to the bathroom, forced him into the tub. By now the water was contaminated with the physical evidence of what was happening: vomit, feces, the biological reality of drowning. John's body joined his brothers. Then came baby Mary, just 6 months old, still in diapers, still nursing, still completely helpless. Andrea drowned her infant daughter. 4 bodies now lay on the bed, their wet pajamas clinging to their skin. And then Andrea went to find her oldest son. Noah was 7 years old. He was the firstborn, the big brother, the one who'd been alive long enough to understand death. Noah saw his mother coming and ran. He ran through the house, 7 years old and terrified, knowing something horrible was happening, but not understanding what or why. Andrea caught him. She was bigger, stronger. She dragged him to the bathroom. Noah fought harder than his siblings. He was older, bigger, stronger. But he was still just a 7-year-old boy fighting his own mother. Andrea held him under the water. She held him down as he thrashed and struggled. She held him down as he tried desperately to live, and she held him down until he stopped moving. When it was over, Andrea carried Noah's body to the bed with his siblings. She laid all 5 children out together: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. She covered them partially with a sheet. Then, at 9:48 a.m., she called 911. "I just killed my kids," she told the dispatcher, her voice eerily calm. Police arriving at scene, officers' testimony footage. When Houston police officer David Knapp arrived, he found Andrea soaking wet, her hair dripping, standing in the doorway. "I killed my kids," she told him. Officer Knapp entered the house. He saw the 4 bodies on the bed. Then Andrea led him to the bathroom, where baby Mary still floated face down in the murky water. Officers who responded to the scene would later testify that they needed counseling after what they witnessed. Seasoned homicide detectives broke down. The image of those 5 children haunted everyone who saw them. Andrea's mugshot, psychiatric evaluation footage. But when police interviewed Andrea, they didn't find a cold-blooded killer like Susan Smith or a calculating murderer like Joel Guy Jr. They found a woman who was completely psychotic. Andrea told detectives that Satan had been living inside her for years. She believed her children were not developing correctly, that they would become evil because she was a bad mother. She thought that Noah would grow up to be a serial killer. She thought Luke would become a mute homosexual prostitute. She believed Satan would punish her children for her failures. She believed they would all burn in hell. So she killed them while they were still innocent, believing that by murdering them, she was saving their souls. I was being driven by Satan, she told psychiatrists. I was doing what was right for my children by arranging for them to be in heaven while they were still innocent. Courtroom footage, first trial, 2002. Andrea Yates was charged with 5 counts of capital murder. At her first trial in 2002, her defense team entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Texas law has a very high bar for the insanity defense. To be found not guilty by reason of insanity, defendants must prove they were so mentally ill at the time of the crime that they didn't know what they were doing was wrong. Andrea's defense argued that she was completely psychotic. She had documented mental illness. She'd been hospitalized multiple times. She'd attempted suicide repeatedly. She believed she was saving her children from Satan. But the prosecution argued that Andrea knew what she was doing was wrong. Their evidence? She called 911 after killing her children. She told police what she'd done. She knew to call for help, which meant she understood the gravity of her actions. On March 12, 2002, after less than 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Andrea Yates guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison, but the conviction wouldn't stand. In 2005, Andrea's defense team discovered that prosecution witness Dr. Park Dietz, a forensic psychiatrist, had given false testimony during the trial. He'd testified about an episode of the TV show Law and Order that featured a woman who drowned her children and successfully used an insanity defense. He suggested Andrea might have gotten the idea from the show. There was just one problem. That episode of Law and Order never existed. Dr. Dietz had fabricated it. An appeals court overturned Andrea's conviction and ordered a new trial. At her second trial in July 2006, the jury heard the same facts: 5 children drowned in a bathtub by their mother. But this time, they heard more complete psychiatric testimony. They heard from doctors who'd treated Andrea. They heard about her extensive history of psychosis. They heard about the warnings that went unheeded. And on July 26, 2006, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a different verdict: not guilty by reason of insanity. North Texas State Hospital. Andrea Yates was committed to North Texas State Hospital in Vernon, Texas, a maximum security psychiatric facility. She's been there ever since. Unlike Susan Smith or Joel Guy Jr. or any of the other killers in this documentary, Andrea wasn't sent to prison. She was sent to a hospital because the legal system determined that she was profoundly mentally ill when she killed her children. And this is where the Andrea Yates case becomes difficult, uncomfortable, morally complicated. Every psychiatrist who examined Andrea agreed she was severely mentally ill. She had documented postpartum psychosis. She had auditory hallucinations. She had delusional beliefs. She had attempted suicide multiple times. Her illness wasn't a defense strategy concocted by lawyers. It was real, documented, and had been flagged by multiple doctors before the murders. Dr. Philip Resnick, a psychiatrist who examined Andrea after the murders, testified she believed that if she didn't kill her children, they would be tormented by Satan and burn in hell for eternity. From her psychotic perspective, she was saving them. In 1999, after Andrea's first psychotic break, Dr. Eileen Starbranch told the Yates family that Andrea should not have more children. The risk was too great. They had another child anyway. In 2001, multiple doctors warned that Andrea was at extreme risk. They prescribed Haldol, which worked. Then Dr. Saeed discontinued it. 2 days before the murders, Andrea sat in Dr. Saeed's office, clearly in crisis. He sent her home. The morning of the murders, Rusty Yates left his psychotic wife alone with all 5 children, knowing she was unstable. Rusty Yates interviews. In the years since, Rusty Yates has expressed regret. In interviews, he's admitted that he and others failed Andrea and the children. He's acknowledged that the warning signs were there, but 5 children are still dead. Noah was 7. He loved Star Wars and wanted to be an astronaut like his dad. John was 5. He was quiet, thoughtful, always asking questions. Paul was 3. He was the wild one, always running, always laughing. Luke was 2. He was just starting to talk, just starting to become his own person. Mary was 6 months old. She never got to say her first word or take her first step. They died because their mother's brain was diseased. They died because the mental health system failed. They died because religious extremism taught their mother that she was damned and her children were doomed. They died because doctors discontinued effective medication. They died because warning signs were ignored. Current footage of Andrea in psychiatric facility, Andrea Yates, is now 69 years old. She remains at North Texas State Hospital, where she receives ongoing psychiatric treatment. Reports indicate that she's expressed deep remorse for what she did. She understands now, with medication and treatment, what she couldn't understand when she was psychotic, that she killed her children. She'll likely spend the rest of her life in psychiatric care. Annual reviews consistently conclude that she remains mentally ill and requires continued treatment. Unlike the other cases in this documentary, Andrea will never be released into society. But she's also not in a prison cell. She's in a hospital, being treated for an illness that, if properly managed, might never have led to tragedy. Legislative changes, mental health awareness, campaigns. The Andrea Yates case changed America's conversation about maternal mental health. It brought postpartum psychosis out of the shadows. It sparked reforms in how the medical system treats mothers with severe mental illness. Texas changed its insanity defense laws to make it slightly easier for juries to consider mental illness. Hospitals updated protocols for treating postpartum psychosis. Advocacy groups formed to support women experiencing severe mental health crises after childbirth. But 5 children still died, and no legislative change, no increased awareness, no psychiatric reform can bring them back. So where does this leave us? Is Andrea Yates evil, or was she sick? The answer, perhaps uncomfortably, is that she was both, or neither, or something in between that our language doesn't adequately capture. When we look at Susan Smith, who drowned her children for a boyfriend, we see evil. When we look at Joel Guy Jr., who murdered his parents for money, we see evil. When we look at Mitchell Blair, who tortured her children and showed no remorse, we see evil. But Andrea Yates is different. She was documented as severely mentally ill. She heard voices. She saw visions. She believed Satan was commanding her. She wasn't trying to profit or pursue romance or satisfy sadistic urges. She was insane. And yet, 5 children are just as dead. Victims' photos, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, didn't die any less horribly because their mother was psychotic. They still drowned. They still suffered. They still lost their lives and futures and dreams. Their deaths are just as tragic, just as preventable, and just as devastating, regardless of whether we classify their mother as evil or sick. Dr. Resnick testimony, medical experts. Dr. Resnick, one of the world's leading experts on filicide, has studied parents who kill their children for decades. He identifies 5 main motives: altruistic, believing you're saving the child; acute psychosis, command hallucinations; unwanted child, like Susan Smith; accidental, abuse that goes too far, and spousal revenge. Andrea Yates falls into the first two categories. She genuinely believed she was saving her children. She was following what she perceived as commands from Satan. This doesn't make the children any less dead, but it does make the case qualitatively different from cold-blooded murder. Mental health crisis hotline information. Here's what we know for certain. Andrea Yates's tragedy was preventable, not by punishing her more harshly, not by ignoring her mental illness, but by taking her documented psychosis seriously. If doctors hadn't discontinued her medication, if Rusty hadn't left her alone with the children, if the religious extremism hadn't convinced her that her children's souls were in danger, if any of the many warning signs had been heeded, Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary might still be alive. Memorial for the children today. There's a small memorial for the 5 Yates children. Their father, Rusty, has since remarried and had another child. He's spoken publicly about his failure to recognize how sick Andrea was. Andrea remains in psychiatric care, where she'll likely stay for the rest of her life. And the question that haunted the jury, haunted the nation, and continues to haunt anyone who examines this case remains unanswered. When does illness become responsibility? When does madness become murder? Where is the line between evil and sickness? The Andrea Yates case doesn't give us easy answers. It gives us a tragedy that was equal parts mental illness, systemic failure, and unspeakable loss. Noah Jacob Yates, age 7, John Samuel Yates, age 5, Paul Abraham Yates, age 3, Luke David Yates, age 2, Mary Deborah Yates, age 6 months, drowned by their mother, June 20th, 2001. She was not guilty by reason of insanity, but those 5 children are still dead because the system failed them and their mother, Dr. George Parnham, Andrea's defense attorney. The Andrea Yates case forces us to consider mental illness as a factor in filicide. But our next case removes any such complexity. When parents adopted children specifically to torture them, when warning signs were repeatedly reported, and when medical evidence showed systematic abuse, the only question becomes, how did they get away with it for so long? Case 8. Danielle Dauphiné. Photo of Elijah Lewis as a toddler, smiling. Elijah Lewis was 5 years old. He had dark hair, bright eyes, and a smile that should have lit up a room. He should have been starting kindergarten, making friends, learning to read, experiencing all the joys of childhood. Instead, Elijah was slowly dying. He was starving to death in his own home while his mother and her boyfriend documented his suffering in text messages, messages so chilling, so cruel, so devoid of basic human compassion that they would shock even seasoned investigators. This is the story of Elijah Lewis, a little boy who begged for food and was punished for being hungry. A little boy whose body was found buried in a park weighing just 19 pounds, less than the average 1-year-old. And this is the story of how, despite warning signs and calls to Child Protective Services, no one saved him in time. Merrimack, New Hampshire, suburban streets. Merrimack, New Hampshire, is a quiet suburban town about an hour north of Boston. Tree-lined streets, good schools, safe neighborhoods. The kind of place where families raise children without fear. But inside a home on Sunset Drive, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, a child was being tortured to death. Elijah Lewis was born in Arizona in 2016. His early childhood was marked by instability. His biological parents, Danielle Dauphiné and Timothy Lewis, divorced when Elijah was just a year old. Timothy Lewis, Elijah's father, later reported that Elijah had developmental challenges and behavioral issues that worsened after moving to New Hampshire with his mother. But despite those challenges, Elijah was still just a little boy who needed care, patience, and love. What he got instead was systematic torture. Danielle Dauphiné, booking photo Danielle Dauphiné, was 35 years old when she killed her son. Court records would later reveal that she herself had been abused and abandoned as a child, a tragic past that her defense attorney would point to as an explanation, though never an excuse. But whatever trauma Danielle had experienced, she chose to inflict something far worse on her own child. And she didn't do it alone. Joseph Stapf was Danielle's boyfriend. He wasn't Elijah's father, wasn't related to him by blood or law, but he became an active participant in the abuse. Together, Danielle and Joseph created a house of horrors for a 5-year-old boy whose only crime was needing food and attention, and they texted about it in real time as Elijah suffered. The text messages between Danielle Dauphiné and Joseph Stapf, recovered by investigators, read like something from a horror movie. Except they were real, and they were about a real child who was really suffering. From Danielle to Joseph, he said he wants food and he wants me to stop starving him because it's not nice. Think about that for a moment. A 5-year-old child, articulate enough to explain that he's being starved, pleading with his mother for food, telling her that what she's doing is not nice. And his mother's response? To text her boyfriend about it, to mock his plea, to continue starving him. Another message from Danielle, I'm going to kill him and I mean it. From Danielle again, I hit him with the shower rod, that's all I did. These weren't vague threats. These weren't expressions of frustration that all parents sometimes feel. These were explicit statements of intent and admissions of abuse, documented in digital evidence that would later form the backbone of the prosecution's case. Joseph's messages to Danielle were equally damning. He told her to give Elijah more food to fatten him up, not out of concern for the child's well-being, but because Elijah's emaciated appearance was becoming impossible to hide. By the fall of 2021, 5-year-old Elijah Lewis weighed just 19 pounds. To put that in perspective, the average weight for a healthy 5-year-old boy is between 35 and 45 pounds. A typical 1-year-old weighs about 20 pounds. Elijah, at age 5, weighed less than a baby. His autopsy would reveal the extent of his suffering: severe malnutrition, facial and scalp injuries from being beaten, pressure ulcers from being confined, acute fentanyl intoxication, evidence of blunt force trauma. This wasn't just neglect. This was systematic abuse and torture of a child over an extended period of time. In the fall of 2021, Elijah's biological father, Timothy Lewis, became increasingly concerned. He was living in Arizona, but he'd been trying to maintain contact with his son. He noticed that Elijah wasn't getting proper medical care. He noticed problems. So he did what he thought was the right thing. He contacted the New Hampshire Division for Children, Youth, and Families, the state's Child Protective Services agency. He expressed concerns about Elijah's medical care and well-being. An investigation was opened, but according to Timothy's later wrongful death lawsuit, CPS didn't act quickly enough or decisively enough to save Elijah. Timothy Lewis told investigators something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He said he couldn't take Elijah back to Arizona because he was concerned for the safety of other children living in his home due to Elijah's behavioral issues. So the pressure, as Danielle's defense attorney later put it, was put on Dauphiné, who didn't have the ability to deal with it. But not having the ability to deal with it doesn't mean starving a child to death. It means seeking help, getting therapy, working with social services, finding support. Instead, Danielle Dauphiné chose murder. October 2021. Elijah Lewis died in his mother's care. The exact date and circumstances of his moments remain unclear because his body was so badly decomposed by the time it was found. What we know is this: Danielle Dauphiné and Joseph Stapf placed Elijah's tiny body in bags and buried him at Ames Knoll State Park in Abington, Massachusetts, about 90 miles south of their New Hampshire home. They crossed state lines to dispose of their victim. Then they went back to their lives and pretended Elijah had never existed. But a 5-year-old child can't just disappear without someone noticing. Elijah should have been in school. He should have been at doctor's appointments. He should have been seen by neighbors, by family members, by mandatory reporters. Where was he? Danielle had an answer prepared. She told people Elijah was with relatives. She told her sister and a friend to lie about Elijah's whereabouts. She actively worked to cover up his death, enlisting others in her deception. But on October 14, 2021, authorities were notified that Elijah was missing. A search began, not just for a living child who'd wandered off, but for a victim of foul play. Search and recovery operation footage. On October 23, 2021, Elijah's body was discovered buried in Ames Knoll State Park. The little boy who'd begged his mother for food, who'd told her that starving him wasn't nice, who'd suffered through beatings and confinement and unimaginable cruelty, was found in a shallow grave far from home. Arrest footage. Perp Walks, Danielle Dauphiné, and Joseph Stapf were arrested and charged with multiple counts including second-degree murder, witness tampering, falsifying physical evidence, and child endangerment. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The text messages alone painted a picture of conscious, deliberate cruelty. But there was more. Testimony from Danielle's sister and friend who'd been asked to lie. Medical evidence of prolonged abuse, the burial site, the cover-up. Courtroom footage, September 2024. In September 2024, Danielle Dauphiné pleaded guilty. After years of legal proceedings, after failed attempts to suppress evidence, after the state prepared for trial, Sheely admitted what everyone already knew. She had murdered her son. She pleaded guilty to one count of second-degree murder for causing Elijah's death and one count of witness tampering for enlisting others in her cover-up. Sentencing hearing, October 25, 2024. On October 25, 2024, 3 years after Elijah's body was found, Danielle Dauphiné stood before Judge Charles Temple in Hillsborough Superior Court South in Nashua, New Hampshire. She read a letter to the court. In it, she tried to explain herself. "I'm so sorry, Elijah, that I failed you as your mother," she said, her voice breaking. She recounted her own life as an abused and abandoned child, as if that somehow explained or excused what she'd done to her son. But Judge Temple wasn't interested in excuses. He sentenced Danielle Dauphiné to 53 years, to life in prison. Timothy Lewis at court, victim impact statement. Elijah's biological father, Timothy Lewis, addressed the court by phone during the sentencing hearing. His words were raw with grief and anger. He said he could never forgive Danielle for her actions. He said he wished she would be haunted by what she'd done for the rest of her life. Danielle's own attorney, David Faulkner, acknowledged that she is haunted, that the weight of killing her child follows her every moment. But that's cold comfort for a father who will never see his son grow up. Joseph Stapf, sentencing, 2022. Joseph Stapf had already been sentenced. In 2022, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, second-degree assault, falsifying physical evidence, and witness tampering. He was sentenced to 22 to 45 years in prison. During his sentencing, prosecutors read aloud the text messages he'd exchanged with Danielle. Messages that showed his full awareness of Elijah's suffering, his participation in the abuse, his callousness toward a starving child. Stapf had texted Danielle, telling her to give Elijah more food, but only to fatten him up so the abuse wouldn't be visible. Not because he cared about Elijah's well-being, because he wanted to avoid getting caught. Photos of young Elijah. Before the abuse, let's remember who the victim was in this case. Elijah Lewis was 5 years old. He was born in 2016 in Arizona. He was adopted by his mother, who should have protected him. He had developmental challenges that required patience and specialized care. Instead of getting help, he got torture. Instead of getting food, he got starvation. Instead of getting love, he got beatings with a shower rod. And through it all, Elijah tried to communicate. He told his mother he was hungry. He asked her to stop starving him. He said it wasn't nice. A 5-year-old child using the vocabulary available to him, trying to explain to his abuser that what she was doing was wrong, and she laughed about it in text messages to her boyfriend. Child Protective Services Building, Case Files. The New Hampshire Division for Children, Youth, and Families, the state's CPS agency, had been contacted by Elijah's biological father with concerns about his care. An investigation was opened, but Elijah still died. In the aftermath, Timothy Lewis filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the state agency, arguing that they failed to protect his son despite receiving reports of concern. The lawsuit forced uncomfortable questions. What did CPS know? When did they know it? What actions did they take? Why wasn't it enough? Elijah Lewis's death represents a catastrophic failure of the child welfare system. Not because social workers are incompetent or uncaring, most are dedicated professionals doing impossible jobs with insufficient resources, but because the system itself is broken. CPS agencies across America are overwhelmed. Social workers carry caseloads that make thorough investigation impossible. They're underfunded, understaffed, and often legally constrained in ways that prevent them from acting decisively, even when children are clearly at risk. In a separate hearing, Judge Michael J. Garner granted the New Hampshire Division for Children, Youth, and Families a partial dismissal in Timothy Lewis's lawsuit, though some claims continue. But no lawsuit, no settlement, no amount of money will bring Elijah back. Pressure ulcers, medical explanation, nutritional deficiency charts. The autopsy report revealed the full extent of Elijah's suffering. Pressure ulcers, also called bed sores, develop when someone is confined in one position for extended periods. They're typically seen in bedridden elderly patients or people with severe mobility limitations. Elijah Lewis was 5 years old. He should have been running, playing, exploring. Instead, he was confined so severely that his skin broke down from the pressure. The malnutrition was so extreme that his body had begun consuming itself. At 19 pounds, Elijah was below the 3rd percentile for his age, meaning 97% of children his age weighed more than he did. And the acute fentanyl intoxication? Prosecutors believe that in Elijah's days or hours, he was exposed to fentanyl. Whether accidentally or deliberately remains unclear. A 5-year-old child, already suffering from starvation and abuse, also had opioids in his system when he died. Text messages displayed again, with analysis. Let's return to those text messages because they reveal something important about the nature of this crime. When Danielle texted Joseph, "He wants food and wants me to stop starving him because it's not nice," she was demonstrating full awareness of what she was doing. She knew Elijah was hungry. She knew she was starving him. She knew it was wrong. Elijah himself had told her it wasn't nice, and she did it anyway. Then she told her boyfriend about it. This wasn't a parent overwhelmed by circumstances who accidentally neglected a child. This wasn't postpartum psychosis like Andrea Yates. This wasn't even cold-blooded murder for financial gain like Joel Guy Jr. This was torture, prolonged, deliberate torture of a helpless child. Courtroom, sentencing remarks. At Danielle's sentencing, prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the abuse. Assistant Attorney General Bethany Durand painted a picture of systematic cruelty, not a momentary loss of control, but sustained abuse over weeks or months. Elijah didn't die in a single incident. He died slowly, over time, from cumulative neglect and abuse that his mother and her boyfriend chose to inflict day after day after day. Every meal they ate while Elijah went hungry was a choice. Every time they beat him with a shower rod was a choice. Every time they ignored his pleas for food was a choice. And every one of those choices led to a 5-year-old boy's body being buried in a state park 90 miles from home. Ames Nowell State Park Memorial. Today, if you visit Ames Nowell State Park in Abington, Massachusetts, you'll find a beautiful natural area with walking trails and ponds. Families come here for picnics and hikes. Children play here. Somewhere in this park, Elijah Lewis's tiny body was buried by the two people who should have protected him most. There's no official memorial for Elijah at the Watts Park. His grave site has been removed of all evidence markers. The earth has been filled in and covered over, but those who know the story can't help but think of him when they visit, a little boy who asked for food and was punished for being hungry. Current prison facilities, Danielle Dauphiné is currently incarcerated in New Hampshire, serving 53 years to life. She'll be eligible for parole when she's in her 90s, if she lives that long. Joseph Stapf is also imprisoned in New Hampshire, serving 22 to 45 years for his role in Elijah's death. Both will spend decades behind bars, but no amount of prison time will undo what they did. Elijah Lewis was born in 2016. He died in 2021. He lived for 5 years. In those 5 years, he should have celebrated 5 birthdays with cake and presents. He should have learned to ride a bike. He should have made friends at school. He should have experienced joy and safety and love. Instead, he experienced hunger, pain, fear, and death. His last words to his mother, the words she mocked in a text message, were a 5-year-old's attempt to explain why what she was doing was wrong. It's not nice. No, Elijah, it wasn't nice. It was evil. Black screen with white text, Elijah Lewis born, 2016 died, October 2021, age 5 years old, weight at death, 19 pounds. He said he wants food, and he wants me to stop starving him because it's not nice. Text message from Danielle Dauphiné. Elijah Lewis died because the adults responsible for him chose cruelty over compassion, starvation over sustenance, torture over care. But our next case takes us to Texas, where another adopted child would die under suspicious circumstances, and where a father's story about an accident would fall apart under scrutiny. Case 9. Wesley Matthews. Her name was Sharon. She was 3 years old. She had dark eyes, a shy smile, and special needs that required patience and care. She'd been adopted from an orphanage in India with the promise of a better life in America, a life filled with opportunity, safety, and love. Instead, she got broken bones, forced feedings, and a death so preventable that even the judge would call it a tragedy born of cowardice and fear. This is the story of Wesley Matthews, a man who claimed to love his adopted daughter but treated her like a burden, a man who, when faced with the consequences of his own actions, chose to dispose of a child's body like garbage rather than call for help. And this is the story of Sharon Matthews, whose short life ended in the darkness of a culvert because her father was more afraid of Child Protective Services than he was of letting his daughter die. Richardson, Texas. Suburban neighborhood Richardson, Texas is an affluent suburb north of Dallas. Tree-lined streets, good schools, safe neighborhoods, the kind of place where families from around the world come to build better lives. In the summer of 2016, Wesley and Sini Matthews brought home a new daughter from halfway around the world. Sharon had been abandoned as an infant in Gaya, India, and taken to an orphanage in Nalanda. She had developmental delays and special needs, but the Matthews family promised to give her the care and love she deserved. For 15 months, they raised Sharon alongside their biological daughter. To the outside world, they appeared to be a loving family, but behind closed doors, something was very, very wrong. Medical records, X-ray imagery, appropriate for broadcast, Dr. Susan DeKeel was a pediatrician certified in child abuse pediatrics. In the months after Sharon's adoption, Dr. DeKeel noticed something alarming. X-rays revealed multiple fractures in Sharon's arms and legs. Not one broken bone, not 2, 5 separate fractures. And based on the way the injuries had healed at different stages, Dr. DeKeel was confident of one thing: these injuries happened after Sharon arrived in America, after she was adopted by the Matthews family. Medical testimony. A 3-year-old child doesn't break bones that easily, not 5 different bones. Not unless something is very wrong, either a serious medical condition that weakens bones or deliberate abuse. Sharon didn't have a bone disease. That left one explanation. Courtroom testimony footage. Dr. Dakil confronted Cindy Matthews, Wesley's wife, about the injuries. Cindy claimed that Sharon had broken her elbow when her older sister pushed her off the couch, an explanation that Dr. Dakil didn't believe based on the medical evidence. But Dr. Dakil's response was even more chilling. When she reported her findings to Cindy Matthews and said she would need to notify Child Protective Services, Cindy's reaction wasn't concern for her daughter. It was concern for herself. According to Dr. Dakil's testimony, Cindy told her that a CPS report would ruin her weekend. Not, "I'm worried about my daughter." Not, "What can we do to keep her safe?" "This will ruin my weekend." Calendar showing October 2017. 5 broken bones in 15 months should have been a screaming red flag. CPS was notified. An investigation was conducted, but somehow Sharon remained in the Matthews home. And on October 7, 2017, Wesley Matthews killed her. Wesley Matthews has told multiple versions of what happened that night. Each story contradicts the last. Each version is more damning than the one before. Let's start with the first lie. October 7, 2017, 8:10 a.m. Police report. On October 7, 2017, at approximately 8 a.m., Wesley Matthews called the Richardson Police Department to report that his 3-year-old daughter Sharon was missing. He told police a disturbing story. Around 3 a.m., in the middle of the night, he had taken Sharon outside as punishment because she wouldn't drink her milk. He said he left her standing alone in an alley behind their home, near some trees, while he went back inside. When he returned 15 minutes later, Wesley claimed Sharon was gone, vanished into the night. A 3-year-old special needs child, outside alone. At 3 a.m., in an alley. Massive search operation footage. The Richardson Police Department launched an immediate search. K-9 units, helicopters, volunteers combing the neighborhood. An Amber Alert was issued. The community rallied to find the missing toddler. And Wesley Matthews went on television to plead for his daughter's safe return, his face a mask of concern. But investigators weren't buying his story. Nothing about it made sense. Detective interviews, investigation footage. What kind of parent takes a 3-year-old outside at 3 a.m. as punishment? What kind of parent leaves a special needs child alone in an alley in the dark? And most importantly, if Sharon had wandered off, why wasn't there any evidence of her presence in the area where Wesley claimed to have left her? The search for Sharon continued for 2 weeks. Police searched everywhere. They drained ponds. They combed through wooded areas. They followed up on every lead. And all the while, Wesley Matthews knew exactly where his daughter was. October 23, 2017, discovery. On October 23, 2017, 2 weeks after Sharon was reported missing, a man walking near East Spring Valley Road in Richardson noticed something in a culvert beneath a road. It was a child's body wrapped in plastic, discarded like trash. It was Sharon Matthews. The location was less than a mile from the Matthews family home. Sharon's body had been there the entire time police were searching. The entire time Wesley was on television asking for help finding his daughter. The entire time the community was praying for her safe return. He'd known where she was all along. Wesley Matthews being arrested. Wesley Matthews was arrested and charged with capital murder. And suddenly his story changed. Now Wesley had a different version of events. There was no late-night punishment in the alley. There was no mysterious disappearance. According to his second story, here's what really happened on October 7, 2017. Reconstruction based on testimony. No graphic imagery. Wesley said that Sharon's doctors had told him she needed to drink milk to gain weight. He was concerned that if she didn't gain weight, doctors would contact Child Protective Services. The family had already been investigated once, and Wesley was terrified of another CPS investigation. So, around 3 a.m., Wesley took Sharon to the garage. He made her drink milk. But according to Wesley, Sharon wouldn't drink it willingly. So he physically assisted her. Think about what that means. A 39-year-old man forcing a 3-year-old special needs child to drink milk against her will in the middle of the night. Wesley claimed that as Sharon drank, she began to choke. Her breathing slowed. She started coughing. And eventually, Wesley said, he couldn't feel a pulse. He believed she had died. Courtroom testimony footage. But here's what makes Wesley Matthews a murderer rather than a tragic figure: what he did next. His wife, Cindy, was asleep upstairs. She was a registered nurse, someone with medical training who might have been able to help. Wesley didn't wake her. He didn't call 911. He didn't try CPR beyond a few half-hearted attempts. He didn't do anything to try to save his daughter's life. Instead, he made a series of calculated decisions that turned a possible accident into a homicide. Evidence photos, plastic bag, culvert location. Wesley wrapped Sharon's small body in a plastic bag, a trash bag, according to testimony. He carried her outside, placed her in his car, and drove to a nearby culvert. And there, in the darkness before dawn, Wesley Matthews disposed of his daughter's body. At trial, prosecutors would ask Wesley about the bag he used. They pulled out a blue recycling bag and asked, "Is this the exact type of bag you put Sharon in?" Wesley admitted it was. Prosecutor Jason Fine. In court, Assistant District Attorney Jason Fine's words at trial would echo through the courtroom and beyond. Great guys and great dads don't stick their daughters in trash bags and dump them in sewage drains. After disposing of Sharon's body, Wesley went home. He cleaned up. He turned off the location tracker on his phone, showing consciousness of guilt, showing an attempt to hide evidence of where he'd been. Then, hours later, he called 911 to report his daughter missing and spun his tale about punishment in the alley. For 2 weeks, as police searched frantically, as volunteers combed the area, as the community mourned a missing child, Wesley Matthews sat on the secret of what he'd done. Autopsy report, medical examiner testimony. When Sharon's body was recovered, it was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. 2 weeks in a culvert, exposed to the elements, had destroyed critical forensic evidence. The official cause of death was listed as homicidal violence, meaning someone killed her, but the exact mechanism couldn't be determined with certainty. This was convenient for Wesley Matthews. Without a definitive cause of death, prosecutors couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt exactly how Sharon died. They couldn't prove whether she choked on milk, was suffocated, was beaten, or died some other way. Courtroom, plea deal proceedings. Prosecutor Jason Fine would later tell reporters, Sharon's little body was so badly decomposed due to the actions of this defendant, the medical examiner could not determine an official cause of death, which could have dramatically changed the way we were able to prosecute this case. In other words, by disposing of Sharon's body and waiting 2 weeks before it was found, Wesley Matthews had destroyed evidence that might have led to a more severe conviction. Whether that was intentional or just a fortunate consequence of his cover-up, we'll never know. June 2019. Trial begins. Wesley Matthews was originally charged with capital murder. If convicted, he could have faced the death penalty. But as the trial approached, prosecutors faced a problem. Without a definitive cause of death, proving capital murder beyond a reasonable doubt would be difficult. Defense attorneys would argue accident, would emphasize Wesley's claim that Sharon choked, would create reasonable doubt. So a deal was made. On June 24, 2019, just as his trial was about to begin, Wesley Matthews pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, injury to a child by omission causing serious bodily injury. He wasn't admitting to intentionally killing Sharon. He was admitting to failing to provide medical care when she needed it, to standing by and doing nothing as his daughter died. The plea deal removed the possibility of the death penalty, but it also meant Wesley would face a sentencing jury who would decide his fate, anywhere from probation to life in prison. Sentencing trial, testimony. For 4 days, a Dallas County jury heard testimony about who Sharon Matthews was and what Wesley Matthews had done. They heard from Dr. Susan Dakil about the 5 broken bones that occurred after adoption, injuries that were never adequately explained, injuries that showed a pattern of abuse. They heard about Wesley's changing stories, first the alley, then the garage, each version more incriminating than the last. They heard testimony that medically it was virtually impossible for a 3-year-old to choke to death while standing up drinking milk, as Wesley claimed. Prosecutor Sherry Thomas told the jury that Wesley's story was medically impossible, meaning he was still lying, even after pleading guilty. Wesley Matthews testifying Wesley took the stand in his own defense. He tried to paint himself as a loving father, overwhelmed by circumstances. He said he regretted his actions. He claimed he'd panicked after Sharon's death. He testified that he wrapped her body in a bag because he wanted to do something nice for her, to protect her body. Prosecutors tore that claim apart. "Good dads don't dump their daughters in sewage drains," Jason Fine repeated. "You wrapped her in a trash bag and threw her away." Wesley admitted, under cross-examination, that he was driven by fear. Fear of CPS, fear of how his wife would react, fear of losing his house and family. Think about that priority system for a moment. His daughter was dying, maybe already dead, and Wesley's thoughts were fear of CPS, fear of his wife's reaction, fear of losing his house. Notice what's not on that list: concern for Sharon, love for his daughter, desperate attempts to save her life. Jury deliberation, verdict. On June 26, 2019, after approximately 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their sentence, life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Courtroom reactions. Wesley Matthews stared ahead, showing no emotion as the verdict was read. His wife, Cindy, was not in the courtroom. She'd already lost custody of their biological daughter and was facing her own legal troubles. The biological daughter, who'd witnessed some of the abuse of her younger sister, had been adopted by Cindy's family in the Houston area by the time of the trial. She'd been removed from the home and placed with relatives who could keep her safe. At least one child survived the Matthews household. Prosecutor's press conference. After the verdict, Dallas County District Attorney John Creuzot addressed reporters. He explained why Wesley wasn't tried for capital murder. The facts of the case simply did not support the capital murder indictment that occurred under the previous administration. Without being able to prove exactly how Sharon died, without being able to show premeditation, the case for capital murder was too weak. So they took what they could get: a guilty plea and a life sentence. Justice, but not perfect justice. Cindy Matthews case. What about Wesley's wife, Cindy Matthews? Cindy was arrested and charged with child abandonment after police determined that on October 6, 2017, the night before Sharon died, Wesley and Cindy had left Sharon at home alone while they took their biological daughter out to dinner, a 3-year-old special needs child left home alone at night. But prosecutors ultimately dropped the charges against Cindy due to lack of evidence. The primary source for the claim that Sharon was left alone was Wesley himself, and by that point, Wesley had proven himself to be a chronic liar. Assistant DA Jason Fine told reporters, "What my thoughts are and what my opinions are, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. I don't have the evidence. If somebody brings us evidence, we will charge her. And if we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, we'll prosecute her. Absolutely." Translation. Prosecutors believed Cindy knew more than she admitted, but they couldn't prove it in court. International adoption agencies, India Sharon's death, sent shockwaves through the international adoption community, particularly affecting adoptions from India. The agency that facilitated Sharon's adoption, Holt International, was suspended by India's Central Adoption Resource Authority, CARA. Indian authorities launched an investigation into how the Matthews family was approved as adoptive parents and why post-placement assessments failed to identify abuse. Lieutenant Colonel Deepak Kumar, CEO of CARA, told reporters, "We have suspended the operations of Holt International because we found it negligent in the assessment of the adoptive parents and also in the post-placement assessment of the family." India's External Affairs Minister, Sushma Swaraj, called for a probe into the adoption process and demanded answers about how Sharon ended up in a home where she was abused and ultimately killed. In response to Sharon's case, CARA made mental health evaluations of NRI, non-resident Indian applicants, seeking to adopt a more important criterion for determining eligibility. Photos of Sharon before adoption. After adoption, Sharon Matthews was born in India in 2014. She was abandoned as an infant, left at a location in Gaya, India, and taken to a local orphanage in Nalanda. She had developmental delays and special needs, but she was alive and had a chance at life. In June 2016, the Matthews family adopted her and brought her to Texas. For 15 months, she lived in their Richardson home. In those 15 months, she suffered 5 broken bones that doctors testified were the result of abuse. In those 15 months, she was physically assisted in drinking milk, forced feeding by a father who was more concerned with her weight than her well-being. In those 15 months, she was left alone at night while her parents took her sister out to dinner. And on October 7, 2017, she died. Whether from choking, suffocation, or abuse, we'll never know for certain because her father disposed of her body and let it decompose for 2 weeks. Culvert location, Memorial Flowers. If you drive along East Spring Valley Road in Richardson, Texas, you might not notice the culvert where Sharon's body was found. It's unremarkable, just a drainage system beneath the road, the kind of infrastructure that exists in every suburb in America. But people who know the story sometimes leave flowers there, small teddy bears, notes to a little girl who deserved so much better than she got. Current Texas prison system, Wesley Matthews, is currently serving his life sentence at a Texas state prison. He's eligible for parole in 2049 when he'll be 69 years old. Whether he'll actually be granted parole is another question. Parole boards tend to look unfavorably on child killers, especially those who disposed of their victims' bodies and lied to police. He filed an appeal asking for a new sentencing trial, arguing that, well, it doesn't really matter what he argued. Sharon is still dead. The Sharon Matthews case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about international adoption, about the vetting process for adoptive parents, about how we identify and intervene in cases of child abuse. 5 broken bones, 5 separate fractures in 15 months. And somehow, despite CPS involvement, despite doctors reporting concerns, despite red flags everywhere, Sharon remained in a home where she was being abused. CPS building, social worker footage. This isn't to blame social workers. Most are overworked, underpaid, and doing their best with impossible caseloads. But it does highlight systemic failures. When doctors report broken bones and parents have implausible explanations, when a mother says a CPS report will ruin her weekend instead of expressing concern for her child, when warning signs pile up, the system should do better. Sharon Matthews should have been removed from that home. She should have been placed somewhere safe. She should still be alive. Instead, she's dead because Wesley Matthews was more afraid of embarrassment than committed to his daughter's well-being. Because he valued his reputation, his house, his comfortable life, more than he valued the life of a 3-year-old special needs child who needed his protection. Photos of Sharon, happy moments, Sharon Matthews was 3 years old. In her short life, she crossed an ocean seeking a better future. She joined a family who promised to love her. She deserved patience for her developmental delays, care for her special needs, and protection from harm. Instead, she got broken bones, forced feedings, and a death her father could have prevented by simply calling 911. And when she died, Wesley Matthews didn't hold her, didn't mourn her, didn't try to save her. He wrapped her in a trash bag and threw her away. Black screen with white text, Sharon Matthews, born 2014, Gaia, India, died October 7, 2017. Richardson, Texas age. 3 years old, adopted June 2016, murdered 15 months later. Great guys and great dads don't stick their daughters in trash bags and dump them in sewage drains. Assistant DA Jason Fine Wesley Matthews chose cover-up over care, disposing of his daughter's body rather than calling for help. But our next case takes us to Detroit, where a mother not only killed her children, she kept their bodies in her home for years, stored in a freezer in the living room, while her surviving children lived in the same house. Case 10. Mitchell Blair, March 24, 2015. A routine eviction in Detroit. A bailiff and moving crew from the 36th District Court arrived at an apartment in the Martin Luther King housing complex on the city's east side. The tenant, Mitchell Blair, hadn't paid rent in months. She'd been given notice. Now it was time to remove her belongings. The apartment appeared relatively normal at first: furniture, belongings, the accumulated possessions of a family. But when the crew went to move a white deep freezer from the living room, someone decided to check inside. What they found would make Detroit homicide detectives, men who'd seen the worst humanity has to offer, physically ill. Inside the freezer were 2 bodies, 2 children, wrapped in plastic, frozen solid. They'd been there for years. This is the story of Mitchell Blair, a woman who tortured and murdered 2 of her own children, then stored their bodies in a freezer while her 2 surviving children lived in the same apartment, walking past that freezer every single day. And this is the story of a woman so utterly devoid of remorse, so completely unrepentant, that she would tell a judge she'd do it all again if given the chance. Mitchell Blair was 35 years old when the bodies were discovered. She was an unemployed single mother of 4 children, struggling financially, living in subsidized housing in one of Detroit's poorest neighborhoods. To the outside world, what little of it she let in, Blair appeared to be just another struggling parent in a struggling city. People knew she had children, though they rarely saw them. Friends and relatives would later say they'd lost touch with the family, that Blair had become increasingly isolated. But no one suspected what was happening behind closed doors. No one suspected that 2 of her 4 children were already dead. Stoney Ann Blair was 13 years old when her mother killed her. She had her mother's name, Blair, and should have been in middle school making friends, experiencing the awkward, wonderful chaos of adolescence. Stephen Gage Berry was 9 years old when he died. He should have been playing video games, learning to ride a bike without training wheels, being a kid. Instead, they were tortured, murdered, and stored in a freezer for years while their 2 younger siblings, Gabrielle, Gabby, and a younger brother, continued living in the apartment, traumatized witnesses to unspeakable horror. Let's establish the timeline because the length of this horror is important. Stephen was killed in August 2012. He was 9 years old. Stoney was killed in May 2013. She was 13 years old. Their bodies were discovered in March 2015. That means Stephen's body was in that freezer for nearly 3 years. Stoney's body was there for almost 2 years. And during all that time, Blair's 2 surviving children, ages 8 and 17 at the time of discovery, were living in the apartment with their dead siblings' bodies in the living room. Imagine being those children. Imagine walking through your living room every day, past a white deep freezer, knowing what's inside, knowing that your brother and sister are in there, knowing that your mother killed them and could kill you too. Imagine the fear, the trauma, the psychological torture of living with that knowledge day after day, month after month, year after year. When police arrested Mitchell Blair and began investigating, she didn't deny what she'd done. In fact, she was disturbingly open about it. She admitted to killing both children. She admitted to the abuse. She admitted to storing their bodies in the freezer. But she showed no remorse whatsoever. At a hearing on June 30th, 2015, Mitchell Blair stood before Judge Dana Hathaway and described what she'd done to her daughter, Stoney. Her words were chilling in their matter-of-factness. "I punched her," Blair said, her voice flat and emotionless. "I put a bag over her head until she lost consciousness." But that wasn't all. Blair also threw scalding water on the 13-year-old girl. She hit her in the head many times. She starved her, limiting her food to oatmeal once a day, just enough to keep her alive while maximizing her suffering. And then, when Stoney finally died from the sustained abuse, Blair wrapped her body and put it in the freezer. The freezer wasn't in a basement or garage. It wasn't hidden away in a storage unit. It was in the living room, a central, visible part of the family's daily life. Every morning, Blair's surviving children would come downstairs for breakfast and walk past the freezer containing their siblings' bodies. Every time they wanted to watch TV or play a game, the freezer was there. Every day, every hour, every moment they spent in that apartment, they were living with physical evidence of their mother's murders. Years later, Blair's surviving daughter, Gabby, would recall the psychological torment of living in that apartment. "I was afraid to even walk by the freezer. Every time I came downstairs to eat breakfast or to play a video game, I had to walk right past the freezer, but there was nowhere else that my mom could hide the bodies." Think about what that sentence reveals. A child so accustomed to her mother's violence that she understood why the bodies were where they were. A child who'd learned to accept the unacceptable because it was her daily reality. Mitchell Blair had a justification for her murders, one she repeated consistently, one she insisted on even when prosecutors told her it wasn't true. She claimed that Stoney and Stephen had sexually abused their younger siblings. She claimed she'd killed them as punishment for that abuse. She claimed she was protecting her other children by eliminating the threat. There was just one problem. It wasn't true. Assistant Wayne County Prosecutor Karen Goldfarb told the court during sentencing that investigators found no evidence, none, that Stephen and Stoney had sexually abused their siblings. Medical examinations of the surviving children showed no signs of sexual abuse. Interviews with the children revealed no disclosures of abuse by their siblings. There was no physical evidence, no testimonial evidence, no evidence of any kind to support Blair's claims. She had created a justification for murder out of nothing. Or perhaps she'd convinced herself it was true through some combination of mental illness and rage. Either way, she'd tortured and killed two innocent children based on accusations that existed only in her own mind. And when confronted with the fact that prosecutors found no evidence of sexual abuse, Blair's response was chilling. "How dare you say that didn't happen to my child," she yelled at Goldfarb in court. "You weren't there." Even faced with evidence that her justification was false, Blair refused to accept it. She clung to her delusion because without it, she'd have to face what she really was, a murderer who killed her own children for no reason at all. Stephen's death in 2012 was ruled the result of blunt force trauma and thermal injuries, meaning he was beaten and burned. Blair later said she didn't intend to kill Stephen, that his death was accidental during a beating. But Stoney's murder in 2013, Blair admitted that was fully intentional. "I definitely meant to kill Stoney," she told the court. "If I had killed Stephen intentionally, I definitely would be proud to say I did, but I didn't." Proud. She would have been proud to say she intentionally killed her 9-year-old son. At another hearing, Blair made a statement that would become infamous. "I don't feel no emotion for the death of them demons. Demons." She called her own children demons. And then she said something even more disturbing. "If I had a chance to do it again, I would." Let that sink in. A mother standing in a courtroom admitting that if she could go back in time, she would torture and murder her children again. Not, "I wish I'd gotten them help." Not, "I wish I'd done things differently." Not even, "I snapped and I regret it. I would do it again." On July 17, 2015, less than 4 months after the bodies were discovered, Mitchell Blair was sentenced. She'd pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree premeditated murder for Stoney's death and 1 count of felony murder for Stephen's death. The other charges, torture, child abuse, were dismissed because the sentences for murder would already ensure Blair never left prison. Wayne County Circuit Judge Dana Hathaway did not mince words during sentencing. "Thankfully, that house of horrors that you created is no longer in existence," the judge told Blair. "I do pray that your remaining children will recover from what they saw and endured in that household." The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mitchell Blair would never be free again, but even during her sentencing, Blair couldn't maintain composure. She used her time to blast the fathers of her children for being absent from their lives. "As horrendous as everyone thinks I am, that's fine," Blair said, her voice rising with anger. "But I'm the only one not lying about anything." The only one not lying? She'd created a completely false narrative about sexual abuse to justify murdering her children. But in Blair's mind, she was the truth-teller, the victim, the one being wronged by the system. Blair's defense attorney, Wyatt Harris, tried to provide context. He told the court that Blair had been abused as a child herself, had little education, and lacked the support system needed to cope with the challenges of parenthood. "I'm not making an excuse," Harris said, "but it didn't allow her to cope with the situation." But at a certain point, explanations become irrelevant. Whatever trauma Blair experienced in her own childhood, whatever support she lacked, whatever challenges she faced, none of it justified torturing 2 children to death and storing their bodies in a freezer. The fathers of Blair's children attended the hearing. They'd been largely absent from the children's lives, a fact Blair threw in their faces during her outburst. Harris, the defense attorney, questioned them. "They chose not to see them. For 2 years you don't see your child?" It was a fair question. Where were these men when their children were being abused? Why hadn't they maintained contact? Why hadn't they noticed something was wrong? But Blair's defense team seemed to miss the obvious point. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Absent fathers don't justify murdering children. After sentencing, Wayne County prosecutor Kim Worthy released a statement. "This sentence today brings to a close the tragic and shocking set of circumstances surrounding the very short lives of Stoney Blair and Stephen Berry. There were no winners, only losers. I truly hope these children can finally rest in peace." But what about the children who survived? Gabby, who was 17 at the time of discovery, and her younger brother, who was 8, had spent years living in that apartment of horrors. They'd witnessed abuse, they'd lived with their siblings' bodies in the freezer. They'd been traumatized in ways most people can't begin to imagine. In subsequent custody hearings, the fate of these 2 survivors was decided. Their fathers fought for custody, but ultimately, both children were placed with their great-aunt, a Detroit police officer who could provide them with the stability and safety they desperately needed. Mitchell Blair's parental rights were terminated. Even if she weren't spending life in prison, she would never have contact with her surviving children again. Dr. James Henry, a child trauma expert, testified that both surviving children would need extensive therapy for years to come. The younger boy, he said, was at the crossroads in his development, meaning the trauma could shape the entire trajectory of his life. The children will need trauma therapy and other counseling for a long time, Dr. Henry explained. They'd grown up in a home where their mother killed their siblings. The psychological impact of that can't be overstated. But there was hope. With proper treatment, with a loving and stable home environment, with time and support, Children can heal even from the worst trauma. In the years since, both surviving children have worked toward recovery. Gabby and her brother went back to school. The younger boy was eventually adopted into a loving home. Both have been in ongoing therapy. Gabby, speaking years later, demonstrated remarkable resilience. "I was afraid to even walk by the freezer. Every time I came downstairs to eat breakfast or to play a video game, I had to walk right past the freezer. But there was nowhere else that my mom could hide the bodies." The casual horror of that statement, a teenage girl describing walking past a freezer containing her siblings' bodies as just another aspect of daily life, speaks to the nightmare these children endured. Mitchell Blair is currently serving her life sentence at Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. She's inmate 889968. She'll die there. But even in prison, Blair continues to cause problems. In 2019, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of assaulting prison employees, adding more time to her already endless sentence. She remains completely unrepentant. In every statement, every interview, every court appearance, Blair has maintained that she was justified in killing her children. She's never expressed genuine remorse. She's never acknowledged that what she did was wrong. She still calls Stoney and Stephen demons. The Mitchell Blair case is unique among the cases we've examined in this documentary. Susan Smith killed for romantic obsession, but at least had the decency to seem remorseful. Andrea Yates was severely mentally ill and now expresses deep regret. Wesley Matthews tried to cover up his crime but admitted fear and panic. Mitchell Blair is different. She's completely, utterly, absolutely unrepentant. She's proud of what she did. She'd do it again. Psychologists who've examined Blair's case suggest she likely suffers from antisocial personality disorder, the clinical term for what we colloquially call sociopathy or psychopathy. Characteristics include lack of empathy, no genuine remorse for harmful actions, manipulation and deceit, blaming others for one's own behavior, grandiosity and sense of entitlement. Blair checks every box. She feels no empathy for her murdered children. She shows no remorse. She blames their fathers and the children themselves for what happened. She presents herself as a victim and truth-teller, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The white deep freezer where Stoney and Stephen's bodies were found was a standing freezer, the kind families use for bulk storage of frozen foods. It sat in the living room of apartment Thrashko 1611 in the Martin Luther King Apartments. For years, it hummed away, keeping the bodies frozen, preserving evidence of Blair's crimes. Friends who visited the apartment walked past it. Blair herself opened it occasionally, though what she thought when she saw her children's bodies, we can only imagine. Actually, we don't have to imagine. We know what she thought, nothing. She felt nothing. To her, those bodies weren't her children anymore. They were demons that deserved what they got. The only reason Blair's crimes were discovered was because she stopped paying rent. If she'd kept up with her rent payments, if she hadn't been evicted, those bodies might still be in that freezer. Blair might still be living in that apartment with her surviving children, the murders undiscovered. But economic reality intervened where the justice system and child protective services hadn't. Blair couldn't pay rent. The eviction notice came, the bailiff arrived with the moving crew, and when they opened that freezer, the house of horrors was finally exposed. The Blair case highlights broader issues about child welfare in impoverished communities. Detroit in 2015 was still recovering from bankruptcy. Social services were stretched thin. Families living in poverty often fell through the cracks. Friends and neighbors later said they rarely saw Blair's children, but in a community where isolation isn't unusual, where people mind their own business out of respect or fear, that didn't necessarily raise red flags. The children weren't in public school. Blair claimed to homeschool them, though by all accounts, little actual education took place. Without mandatory reporters like teachers seeing the children regularly, abuse could continue undetected. An important detail, Blair had 4 children by 2 different fathers. Stephen Barry was the father of the younger son, and Stephen, the 9-year-old who was killed. Alexander Dorsey was the father of Gabby and Stoney, the 13-year-old who was killed. At custody hearings after Blair's arrest, both fathers fought to maintain parental rights to their surviving children. But Judge Edward Joseph, who presided over the family court proceedings, had harsh words for both men. To Dorsey, he said, "Mr. Dorsey certainly hasn't been a good father, though he ultimately allowed Dorsey to retain his parental rights to Gabby." To Barry, the judge was even harsher, terminating his parental rights to the younger son entirely due to Barry's lack of housing, employment, and stability. The judge's reasoning was clear. These fathers had abandoned their children to Blair's care, despite knowing or having reason to know that something was wrong. They bore some responsibility for failing to protect their children. The discovery of the bodies shocked Detroit, a city that's seen more than its share of violence and tragedy. The case made national headlines. The apartment building where it happened became known as the House of Horrors. Eventually, the building was demolished. The Martin Luther King Apartments no longer exist. The physical structure where those horrors occurred has been erased from the landscape, but the trauma continues for those who survived. Stoney Ann Blair was born in 2000. She should be 25 years old now. She should be finishing college, starting a career, maybe falling in love, experiencing all the joys and challenges of young adulthood. Stephen Gage Barry was born in 2003. He should be 22 years old. He should be finding his way in the world, figuring out who he wants to be, building a future. Instead, they're both dead, murdered by their mother, stored in a freezer for years, denied even the dignity of a proper burial until long after their deaths. Stoney Ann Blair, born 2000. Died May 2013, age 13 years old. Stephen Gage Barry, born 2003, died August 2012, age 9 years old. Found in a freezer March 24, 2015. Their mother's final words about them: "I don't feel no emotion for the death of them demons. If I had a chance to do it again, I would." Mitchell Blair represents evil in its purest form, unrepentant, remorseless, proud of causing suffering. But our next case takes us back to 1983, to Oregon, where another mother would shoot her 3 children and blame a stranger, only to be undone by the testimony of a surviving daughter who found the courage to identify her own mother as the shooter. These 10 cases span different decades, states, and methods, yet they share one horrifying commonality: parents who were supposed to love, protect, and nurture instead chose to torture, poison, burn, shoot, starve, and murder the most vulnerable people in their lives. From Gabriel's tiny body found with BB pellets embedded in his skin to Sharon's remains dumped like garbage, from the Turpin children shackled in darkness to Blair's frozen children treated as meat, these cases force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that evil doesn't always come from strangers, but sometimes from those who call children mine. How do we, as a society, prevent these horrors when they happen behind locked doors? The answer lies in vigilance, in listening when children cry for help, in investigating when something doesn't seem right, and in creating systems that prioritize child safety over parental privacy. These children's memories demand we do better. Their stolen futures compel us to act. Which of these cases shocked you the most? And what warning signs do you think our society needs to watch for better? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this video informative, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into true crime cases that changed the legal system. Remember, awareness can save lives. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.